I love to see the towns passing by and to ride these rails neath God's blue sky. Let me travel this land from the mountains to the sea, 'cause that's the life I believe He meant for me. And when I'm gone and at my grave you stand, say God called home your rambling man.
Welcome to Ramble Man Podcast, episode number 47. This one is with LaRue Cook. Title him an author and an Uberist. LaRue has a fascinating story that I'm not going to really spoil here, but he's a great writer. I got to see him tell a story or two from his book, Man in the Rearview Mirror, live and in person at Union Avenue Books here in Knoxville, Tennessee. Then drove down to Decatur, Georgia to interview him. Great guy, fascinating story. Buy the book. If you'd like to learn more about LaRue, go to his website at LaRueCook.com. That's LaRueCook.com. From there, he has outbound links to buy the book. Again, buy the book. It's really good. Instead of doing a sponsor this week, I'm going to just say buy the book. LaRueCook.com. Without much further ado, here's the interview.
I mean, we could, even though it's not not necessarily your style, I mean, we could roll off with how you showed up at the reading, and then this kind of came out of that, and that could roll us into the book and probably wind up rolling us into some other stuff.
So the honest, Sarah invited me, her friend Sarah Harder, and then I kind of looked at it, and usually, here's the nature of Facebook, I'll put interested if it's, anything, whatever, and then when it gets close to the day, I'll be like, do I have time to do that? And so that one, I hate to say it, but I looked on the back of the book and saw the Rick Bragg thing. And I was like, all right, I'm going to go to this.
We're not recorded yet, are we?
Yeah.
Oh, we are? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is how it goes. We just roll right into it. So that's how I kind of was like, it was almost like a 1-2 punch. Like, okay, there's this. Okay,
right.
I'm going.
Well, and it's interesting because that was the first reading that the book included the Bragg blurb because... Okay. The Rick Bragg blurb, because so Rick for listeners who may know who Rick is, he's sort of this Southern bard, and he wrote this memoir called All Over But the Shoutin', and he was still working at the New York Times at that point, and then left the New York Times, under some controversy a few years later.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the Times has had a practice of using freelancers where, like, a writer can't get to all these sort of places, right? Like, I mean, Rick's the feature writer. He's pulling everything together and making it a narrative, but sometimes they would get stringers to get color or to get quotes.
Right.
And according to the Times, quote unquote, and this has probably been litigated or something, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But a stringer claimed that Bragg used some of their material without acknowledging them, without giving them a reporting credit. And so then there was, and that was kind of post like Stephen Glass and like this real sensitivity to, writers making stories up.
Right.
And so Bragg being Bragg, and I think I don't know how he would feel about me saying this. Who knows if he'll ever get back to him or not. But Bragg's kind of an ornery guy, and he was just sort of, I can cuss, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. He was just sort of like, fuck you guys, like I'm out.
Yeah.
Because he'd written All Over But the Shout, and he had this following. So he went back and was like, I'm going back to fucking Alabama.
Because he had won the Pulitzer at that
point. He'd won a
Pulitzer
by then. Yeah, I think he'd won a Pulitzer. So All Over But the Shoutin' came out in 94, I think. I think that's right. And and I think he'd won the Pulitzer by that point already.
Oh, okay. I thought the Pulitzer was the later 90s, but
maybe it was. I don't know. Maybe I have a reprint of all over. But anyway, point being is that he had his following, and he was like, I'm going back to Alabama. I think he may still do some adjuncting in journalism at Alabama. But he just went and he's like, I'm going to write books.
So he, at the Bijou, said he moved back home because his mom wasn't doing great. Yeah. And that's kind of the reason why he's back there, because she's getting up in age. And he was like, I kind of feel like I need to be with her, taking care of her and all that, which, yeah.
And I'm sure that's a lot of it. I mean, if you go on his Wikipedia page, there's sort of, it mentions the controversy, but I think he's sort of put it in his past and just he's done with that. But the reason that I got to know Bragg at all was, so I was in 2011, I was the associate editor for college football at ESPN the magazine, and every year obviously we do a college football preview issue.
Right.
And actually this was 2012. This was the next year. That was like that run of SEC BCS wins, like 8 or 9 straight, right? Yeah. And so it was like we did this issue called Curse the SEC, and it was like all these stories about teams that could potentially stem the tide, pun intended.
Yeah.
And my editor-in-chief at that time, he was like, who can we get to write like this opening essay about like what college football means to the South? Why is it religion in the South and this?
Yeah.
And of course we came up with Rick Bragg.
Yeah.
And it was so funny because I was I was 25, 26. I had really not worked with any big name writers to that point. And this was my first big chance to sell a big writer on doing an essay. So I call Rick. He's living in like Fairhope, Alabama, and he's been working on a Jerry Lee Lewis biography, and which I think is it's out like he was in the final stages of that. And I called him and I pitched him on the essay, and he was just like, brother, that sounds like eating ice cream, because he's been so in the weeds with the Jerry Lee Lewis edits. Yeah. Well, what was funny, again, I'm probably telling too much behind the scenes, but the going rate at that time for magazine writing was $2 a word, which is pretty damn good.
Okay.
Especially if you're looking at 4,000 word features,
Yeah.
And so, but we would give, certain name writers $2.50, $3. And I didn't know anything about negotiating, and I wasn't given any guidelines. I was just told, get him.
Yeah.
So I was like, so, what do you think about $2.50? And like, he almost hung up the phone. He's like, no, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I can't do it for that. He's like, $4 is my rate. So we got Bragg for $4 a word. Wow. And then that relationship ended up spawning 2 more essays over the next 3 years that I worked with him.
$5 and $6 a word.
Right. Exactly. But those are the rewarding experiences as an editor, where you don't have to do a lot of editing with writers like that. What you're doing is you're talking through ideas, you're sparking ideas for them, and then when you go in, you're just chiseling,
I was going to say, I got to assume there's a bunch of different levels. Like some people, you need to get the ball rolling, and some people, it's almost like you're sitting back going, what do you think? Yeah. What do you want to talk about?
Because, Bragg grew up in North Alabama, in the swirl of football, craziness. And, he would take jabs at me and say, I was from the North because I was from Tennessee, and stuff like that. So, but it was just so the reason, to circle back to the blurb itself and why we didn't have it on the first printing was, Rick had, he's pretty old school, and he's a phone guy, and he'll check his email once a month or something. Yeah. But he was also under the weather, had been sick. So out of the blue, like I thought, he's probably busy. Because it's a lot to ask somebody to read a 200-page book and write the blurb, especially somebody that's as busy as he is. And out of the blue, right after New Year's, he got back to me and said, I'm sorry, I've been under the weather, but I'd love to, if you can get me a book, I'll blurb it. And so I sent it, and he wrote just this great blurb. It's pretty cool. You kind of have to take small victories in these processes, because when you go independent press, independent author, you don't have that big PR mouthpiece of HarperCollins or whatever. So when Rick Bragg says your book's an excellent read, you kind of have to say, well, I mean, I can't ask for a whole lot more.
No.
Even if I'm not on the cover of the New York Times or whatever. But so anyway, that's the story of Rick, and he wrote me a real nice note individually from not just the blurb, but just saying that I think he put it that I read the first 50 pages in one setting, as he said.
Yeah.
And that's a lot for Rick to say. So
I came to him a little later. Now I can't remember. Have you ever written for Garden and Gun?
Oh yeah. I mean, he writes for Garden and Gun.
No, have you ever written for Garden?
Oh no.
Oh man, I feel like you'd be perfect for Garden.
Well, I did write for the Bitter Southerner.
Yeah.
Well, an excerpt from the collections in the Bitter Southerner.
Yeah.
It's funny that you say that too. And I'm probably going to listen back and realize how many times I say it's funny you say that.
No, that's fine.
Which is okay, right?
Now that you say that, I'm going to edit and put even more in there. Right. It's going to become a drinking game.
Yeah. Once Rick got back to me, I said, "Hey, do you have a contact at Garden and Gun?"
Right.
And he was like, "Well, send this guy an editor, or send this guy an email, this editor an email." And it was the damn main editor at Garden and Gun. And he's like, "Tell him Rick's." I told him, I think the email subject line was, "Rick Bragg thinks I'm not half bad." And so
nice.
he responded, but it was, I mean, look, I've seen how the sausage is made, and in magazines and in journalism in general, and so I know how bombarded they are with. I mean, and press releases from names much bigger than mine, and presses much larger than mine, and so they can't get to those books either. So he was nice and got back to me and CC'd a book editor there, but I never heard back. But I mean, if they paid me, I'd write anything. The funny part about me is that I'm not a particularly good pitch artist, and by that I mean, the art of selling the story you want to write.
Right.
I'm good at being dropped into situations and then figuring the story out. But if you're, if you're I'm a no-name in terms of writing. Like, I was a good editor, but in terms of writing, I don't have a pedigree. And so if you want to get those top name places to take you seriously, you got to pitch. I mean, you got to sell your story.
Right.
You got to have a story before you ever go to them.
Okay.
And at least that's been my experience.
Well, I feel like with our conversation at lunch, there's 10 stories in there.
We talked a lot about, for the listeners, we talked a lot about basically the layers of gentrification going on across the Southeast, but across the U.S., and kind of the different ways in which that gentrification looks, where Atlanta, Georgia versus Knoxville, Tennessee versus Nashville, Tennessee versus L.A., San Francisco, New York. And I think the other thing, you're right, there's 10 or 15 stories swirling, but it's that art of the pitch. Like, you've got to crystallize that thing for those national magazines and national outlets in 5 sentences.
Right.
I've got a friend who, Fred McKendra, who lives in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is also where Oxford American is based.
Yeah.
And he's really done well. I mean, he writes for Oxford American, writes for BuzzFeed News, or long reads.
Yeah.
And he told me, he said 5 sentences.
Oh, I was going to say, just keep going. I won't just point this.
And so he told me 5 sentences, and if you can distill, your pitch down into that, you've got a much better chance at.
Which is, I would say, for something like that, is harder, because that feels like that's more of a multi-part series, like talking about the history.
Yeah. I mean,
about the economics and the race issue of it all, and the culture.
Right. Well, what you really learn is that, it's like this book deal that I got, the collection of essays, Man in the Rearview Mirror, which is how this all came to be, right? This podcast even started. I had a shorthand with one of the editors at the publication. So it's like, I already had that shorthand where I could go a little bit longer in my pitch letter.
Right.
Like, we could talk on the phone, and then he said, well, put it in words. But where you're cold pitching these editors, they don't know you. They don't have any.
And like you said, you're getting tons of them.
Yeah, right. And very often, you've already got a staff of writers, so it's like you're even having to say, well, why am I going to take some space or opportunity away from my staff writers to give you this opportunity?
Well, and it's kind of wild because, and this can segue us into the state of journalism right now, but
oh yeah,
I look at like, do you know Steve Wild? Well, you said you listened to that one.
Yeah,
so
Steve
Wildsmith,
the music
he's one of the best
journalist.
writers I've ever known, and he wrote for the Maryville Daily Times. Him and Wayne Bledsoe essentially were the backbone of the Knoxville music scene during a lot of downtime.
Right.
But I look at somebody like Wildsmith, and he'll write posts on Facebook that I'm like, how are you not making money off of this? But he is in a positive, he is doing so much work for Cornerstone Recovery because he is a person in recovery that he's doing great work. So I don't feel like pushing him and going, good God, dude, come on, man.
Well,
and that's just me because I stumble through my shit.
Well,
so.
these discussions, I think you always run this interesting risk of sounding like sour grapes when you're a writer and you're not sort of out there in these major publications having this name. And I don't think that it's got anything to do. I mean, talent matters, but I'll tell you as an editor, good writers are a dime a dozen. Great writers aren't necessarily, but you don't become great, I don't think, until you do it for as long as Wildsmith has done
or
it.
like David Carr.
Yeah, or you get,
you
get one of the preeminent names in sports journalism is Wright Thompson, who I worked with a couple times at ESPN, and I mean, he found this moment in ESPN's history where there was this thing that used to be called like e-ticket. Before it was like e-ticket became E60, and it was when long form journalism was kind of trying to figure itself out, what that meant in the digital age. And Wright just found himself in this opportunity where they were just letting him write these 10,000 word pieces because they were online and they needed content. And why I'm saying all that is that now he was able to write enough where he got polished enough. Yeah. And he can write. I mean, he's a hell of a writer, but he wrote a lot of fucking stories. Yeah. Before he ever got to that echelon.
Yeah, I'm a graphic designer. I understand.
Yeah,
I
right.
You've got from 25 years ago, and it's like I want to set fire to all of this.
Yeah,
it's so bad. But,
well, and then in Wildsmith's case, I mean, I think you do. I mean, hell, I'm only.
The reason why I brought him up was he still writes for the Daily Times, but they laid him off. Like, that's the weird part. Like, he's now a freelance. He's no longer... Because you were saying about having people on staff, and now it's like, well, son of a bitch. Like, that happened to, like, Randall Brown, too.
Yeah. And, it's interesting It's like, that's the chasm between what I would consider national media outlets and, like, smaller outlets. It's like... They cut a cost by getting rid of full-time, but then they say, oh, you can come back and do part-time for us because their per-word rates are probably pretty low, if I had to guess.
And they're not paying insurance or paying for a computer.
Whereas ESPN, the type of freelance writer they would attract or would like to attract is looking for a certain per-word rate, and they're like, look, we've already got these staff writers that we're paying not only salary but benefits. Right. Why would we, give up those... give up those opportunities, and why would we waste that money? Because I mean, ESPN's gone through 3 rounds of layoffs or 4 rounds of layoffs since I've been gone. 3 years ago. Jeez. And so, I mean, they're using everybody that's on their staff. They are pushing, to the maximum to get their value, to get their bottom line out.
And it's kind of wild because and I think I told you this, I worked for a company, got talked back. I worked for the paper back in the day, worked in advertising and marketing. And then I went away and I got talked back into coming back. I got told it was more like an agency and I was going to be doing work for 14 papers across the country. I came in and immediately it was like, nope, it's not that. We got you now, essentially. Mm-hmm. God love my old boss. But that was at the time right before Gannett bought out EW Scripts.
Okay.
So when that process went through, it was kind of wild because when that process went through, the building was already half empty at that point. Mm-hmm. But then after I got laid off, that's 3 years to the day today. One of my buddies who still works there, he showed me the office now, and there's nobody there. He was like, I'm not kidding. There's like maybe, I think he said 17 people on the lower floor right now. And he was like, my employees are in Florida. He was like, I don't have staff here.
It's so interesting to have been a part of I graduated University of Tennessee in 2007. The economy was about to tank 2 or 3 years later. And then journalism was about to undergo this massive existential crisis.
Right.
Because digital. I mean, I remember being in New York in spring of 2006, sitting in a room with the then managing editor of the New York Times, and that person saying basically to the effect that he just didn't believe that bloggers were going to be the next wave, or didn't believe that the internet was going to, and it just, and for him to say it wasn't particularly ignorant at that point. No. It was just, the landscape was completely unknown. And it's interesting that we're doing this now because I got my start at the Maryville Daily Times as a sports writer with John Bryce, Leonard Butts, a guy named Glenn LaFollette, who's now in Chicago and is out of the industry. I think Bryce might be working for 247 or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, then I got that DC internship with Scripps.
Yeah.
Which took me to DC for 4 months, and when I was a junior in college, came back. Phil Kaplan, who I think you work or knew or know.
We know each other by sight.
Right. Yeah. He just contacted me. He'd seen my stuff in the Daily Times, and then heard that I had that Scripps internship, and then I started writing high school sports for the Sentinel. My senior year, and then the now defunct Metro Pulse. I did a few movie music reviews, but a lot of that stuff you can't find it because it didn't get committed to the internet the same way. Like the stuff I wrote for the Sentinel and the Metro Pulse.
I think was Jesse Fox Mayshark gone by the time you got to Metro Pulse? I think he had went up to the Times for a while.
I think so.
He was like an editor, but I'm friends with him, and he and a couple of the other guys from Metro Pulse had found through like Wayback Machines on internet. I think it's called like the Wayback or the Time Portal or something, where it can look for archives, and they found some old Metro Pulse articles, but it's you really have to dig to find them.
Well, so I was not too long after I'd left to go to New York was when Scripps and the Sentinel bought
Metro
the Pulse.
Yeah.
And then it went, when it was shuttered, and then they started the Mercury. And when I was coming up to Knoxville to read, I contacted Jack Neely.
Yeah.
And when I first looked at the Mercury site, I was like, oh, they're still up and running. But then when I emailed Jack right after that, I looked at the fine print, and it's like they're just keeping the site alive.
Right.
But and I was. Jack knows me. I wouldn't call us like close acquaintances, but I'm a big fan of his work. But anyway, I understand why, but it is sad that my dream job, and this is no joke, when I first got out of journalism school, I wanted to write for something like the Metro Pulse.
Okay.
Like an alt weekly where there were these 5,000 word cover stories that really dug into a very interesting topic in the community.
Yeah.
But then also, supported the local music scene.
Yeah.
It kind of rolled its eyes at sports, but acknowledged the behemoth that is University of Tennessee football in its kind of irreverent ways.
Yeah.
Because that was what journalism was for me. It was like never about, I say this in the book, I never set out to write a book about myself. I literally wanted to tell the stories of the communities. And I went up to New York and I got jaded and I got burned out. And, and then I became an editor, and, I got great opportunities to work with writers like Rick Bragg, and others, Ryan McGee, who's still there and is on SEC Network. And
was Bill Simmons' time already come and gone by the time? I can't remember when
I got to the magazine. So the magazine, when I got there, was in New York. It was in New York City. It was 34th between 5th and Madison.
Right.
And we had this little office where Bristol was like, you stay down there and you do this magazine stuff with these splashy photos and design.
Yeah.
They didn't really understand why, but they're like, we got enough money. Just do a magazine. Yeah. Well, Simmons was the back page columnist when I arrived for the magazine.
Okay.
And he had I think he had been done, or maybe he wrote that. What was that? He wrote a book about the Red Sox finally winning. It was like Now I Can Die in Peace or something like that. And I was actually a researcher on some of his book of basketball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I was in that office when he was doing that book, but there used to be a thing, but pre-Grantland, now defunct Grantland,
Yeah.
there was a thing called Page 2 on ESPN.
Okay.
And they literally had like Hunter S. Thompson right before he died would write for Page 2.
So this came up like a year ago with a buddy of mine, and we were sitting around talking, and he was talking about a Hunter S. Thompson article, and he found it on one of those way backs. He was like, my buddy Jason was, grew up kind of in Arkansas, and he broke his arm so many times playing sports, he had to give up playing sports. So he became a sports writer at like 14 or 15 or something like that, wrote for the paper. Like, it was crazy, but he was the one, he was like, that may be one of the best pieces. There was one, the Hunter S. Thompson one, he's like, I think that may be one of the best things I've ever read.
Well, and that was like a fun time because the internet was this Wild West, and
that's back when newspapers were trying to decide, like, are we behind a paywall? Are we free?
Yeah, and they were trying to get names to bring people to the site. But then they were also like, it was sort of, nobody knew yet if it was going to be monetized, how it was going to work. So it was like, fuck, we'll let Hunter S. Thompson write 10,000 words about a fucking horse race or whatever it was. And then, Simmons got his start in that era when people wanted to read 20,000 word blog posts.
Oh, yeah.
That were just these esoteric, Boston-centric, basically stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
But he had all this pop culture weaved in. And so anyway, that's all to say that then he became a TV personality for ESPN, and in 2011 they post economy crash, post like, oh shit, print is about to have a real crisis. They closed all New York operations, ESPN I'm talking about, and said, if you all want to keep your job, you'll come to Bristol, to Connecticut, to the headquarters. And a lot of people actually didn't make the move because they were New York centric. They were designers and photographers who didn't give a damn about sports. They were like just amazed that they got to do, because also, if you were, for those who have seen ESPN the magazine, it's that
gorgeous.
What's that old school broadsheet to like the old Rolling Stone. So designers would just have a field day, and photographers, because they got these huge pages to work with. Well, anyway, the reason I went really was, well, one, the money. I got offered I got offered to get out of research. Because I was writing some, but not a lot, and I got to be an editor with a full-time salary. That's to say that around the time we got to Bristol in 11, 12, I don't know the timeline exactly, but Grantland was becoming a thing.
Okay.
And there was so much philosophical differences in that industry. Like, people were like, well, wait a minute, why do we need Grantland if we have the magazine? Because aren't you all doing the same stuff?
Right.
And
is it duplicating content? Is it new content?
And then when you show up, the fact of the matter is, when you show up at the mothership in Bristol, .com was a lot of old school newspaper people.
Oh.
And so there was even a little bit of headbutting over, like, well, what should sports content look like, and should we continue to do what the fans want, which is box scores? I mean, you'd be surprised. Like the traffic on that site when I was there. Now I don't know how the iterations of streaming and everything have changed things, but box scores were always the most viewed on the site.
Even though Twitter was a thing, like Major League Baseball, they wouldn't really post the updates because they wanted people to watch it on TV or listen to it on the radio.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't post that shit. Whereas now, I'm a Dodgers fan. You watch the Dodgers feed during a game, and it's 300 tweets.
Oh, yeah,
it's crazy. Well, but back then they didn't think about that. They were still in that old school mindset. Well,
people often wonder, like, why the hell did you leave ESPN? Did you hate it there? Did you what? I mean, I met some really talented people and became the writer and the editor and even the teacher that I am because of my experiences there. And I have a lot of respect. I mean, I was a 90s kid. I fell in love with Kenny Mayne and Stuart Scott and Rich Eisen. I mean, that was what me and my buddies watched every Saturday morning, and we would rewatch, because they would just replay SportsCenter.
Oh yeah.
But the one thing ESPN, they had the foresight to buy up live sports rights.
Okay.
And they got into these huge cable deals. This is way before anybody could have seen cord cutting. And the one thing that they did, for all the foresight they had, they didn't foresee the streaming. And so they're doing fine. I mean, everybody see these layoffs and they're like, oh my gosh, ESPN's actually finally starting to, there's a, a little bit of a dent in the facade, let's say. But all it was that they just weren't able to make the same moves that the smaller companies were able to make around streaming.
Right.
And they I think now they finally got their streaming app up and running, and these cable deals are coming to an end. So ESPN will be fine. It's just that you were in the industry.
Yeah.
You cannot underestimate how overwhelming it was when people realized, like, oh shit, people aren't coming to homepages.
No.
They're going to Facebook. They're going to Twitter.
Yep.
They're going around you to get to what they want.
Yeah.
So then every story you created was content, and then you had to figure out, okay, how do I take this one little piece of content and repackage it for Facebook, for Twitter? You had to create a new page every time for one story.
And also make articles online, make sure the shareable features is at the top, because people are going to read the headline and immediately going to want to share it without reading the damn article.
Oh yeah, well, and then there's so many. That's just the beginning of it all. Like that proliferates into, well, wait a minute, how does that affect, live video?
Yeah.
Now it's a world that I kind of understand it from afar, but by no means would I ever want to work in that environment. And maybe that makes me sound curmudgeonly at 34, but I went there because whether I cared about sports or not, I cared about storytelling.
Right.
And I cared about a certain care, that was taken with that storytelling. And that's a little controversial for me to say, because I don't want to take anything away from the content that's being put out on all media outlets.
Right.
But at the end of the day, the stories that we put in the magazine would go through, 6, 7, 8 checks and balances, multiple edits, multiple rounds.
Legal.
But then fact checking,
Yeah.
I started out, my job was a fact checker, my first job, and sure, fact checking was making sure that, you'd be surprised how many errors get through, but, making sure proper nouns were spelled right. But then also it was like these nuances of fact checking, to make sure that it was right, it was accurate. And sure, that came into legality, because when you print something and it's there for perpetuity, it's a whole lot different than being able to go online and change it and say correction, update 4:40 a.m. But so that's just to say that you're talking about how your building was empty.
Yeah.
So it was literally called Building Zero, because each building on ESPN's campus is a number.
Yeah.
And the magazine staff was put into Building Zero. January of 2016, which is what starts my existential crisis in my book. I put my 2 weeks in, I walk out. Within 3 weeks, they name a new editor-in-chief, Allison Overholt. Within 6 months, they basically move everybody out of that building, put them in building 4, which is where .com is housed.
Okay.
So it became this one team mentality. And then it looks like I can't remember if they have foosball tables or not, but it's like this Google glass wall. And it's just a different place. And that's not for better or worse. It's just to say that I didn't see the writing on the wall specifically, but literally everything changed within 6 months of me walking out. And then a lot of my colleagues aren't there anymore. They've gone to The Athletic, which is a paid site for sports. So it's just a different place.
Yeah, I'm curious, because then you also have, and I can't remember the name of it. Is it called the Players Club or something? It's something like...
Oh, the Players Tribune?
Players Tribune. Wasn't it like Jeter? It was like 4 big athletes started this in their own, and every time I read it, because it seems to go back to that, you were saying 20,000 word. Anytime I look at that, I'm like, are these guys really writing this, or is this ghost written like crazy?
Well, I don't pretend to know.
Yeah.
But what I do know is that I don't know if he's still involved with it, and I'm kind of hesitating to use some names.
Yeah. But there were like 4 major athletes. I think it was like
athletes, but there were editors behind these guys.
Okay.
And women. I don't know who started it.
Okay.
But one of the founding editors of ESPN the magazine, I think, had a hand in getting the Players Tribune off the ground.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they're ghost written. I don't want to speak on that because I
Right.
don't know. But I know that they work closely with editors
Okay.
to create that content.
And it could be like, a lot of books like that.
Oh,
I've heard
yeah.
from comedians saying, "Oh, I didn't write that book. I read that. I had somebody essentially interviewing me,
and they wrote.
and they wrote it." But one of the guys who actually wrote his own book. He was laughing because he was like, "I wrote that book. It was a nightmare." He's like, "I have what's it called? Where he can't read
Dyslexic?
dyslexia."
Yeah.
And he was like, he had his audio book of his book is twice as long as it should be, and it's hilarious because he's constantly going, and then fuck. Bert Kreischer, that's his name. But it's one of those. Is either one any more valid? Like, it's essentially, if you're saying everything, if you dictated it all into a microphone and then had somebody else write it up, does that mean you're not a writer? Like,
I mean, look, writers are precious, number one.
Okay.
But number two, writing is a collaboration. I mean, I'm willing to bet that behind any great writer, or quote unquote what we would call great writer, was a pretty damn good editor.
Okay.
And the best writers I ever worked with were ones that weren't afraid to be edited.
Okay.
They wanted to be pushed. And so why I think there's a comparison to be made is that, so a writer that I worked closely with, Ryan McGee, who does a podcast with, it's called Marty and McGee, and it's mostly NASCAR. Well, not mostly. It's a lot of NASCAR. They now have a show, though, on SEC Network about college football.
Okay.
But Ryan McGee, he's based in Charlotte, and he wrote Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s book.
Oh, okay.
So he and Dale would do the tour together. And the same idea. I mean, Dale's dictating his story.
Yeah.
And Ryan has all, but what Ryan adds to it is that Ryan covered NASCAR for all these years, covered his dad Dale, so he can add these nuances that maybe Dale Jr. wouldn't just see because he was inside of the world.
Like applying context.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And because when you're writing your own story, I mean, that's the most difficult part about writing a book about your life is like you have so many blind spots because you can only see it through the lens that you saw it through.
Right.
Like my book. Like, I mean, I was craving an editor once I got my manuscript together.
Yeah.
Because they're going to ask you questions that you just wouldn't think, you would have never thought.
There's The Princess Bride, Carrie Elways.
Right.
So he did a book on The Princess Bride. But what he did was he had everybody else involved pepper in and give commentary throughout the book, which I thought was a fascinating take on that book. Because like Rob Reiner would jump in and be like, well, at this point, this is what we were thinking when we went with Carrie or all this stuff. And it was great. Like, it was like...
And people love, I mean, that's, DVDs are now obsolete, but that's why you bought the Criterion Collection cut, because you could hear, I mean, people who are listening who know me know I love Sling Blade, and like you can hear all of Billy Bob's stories about bumfuck Arkansas and trying to find actors, because a lot of those actors were first time actors, never had before, and so people really like that, and this is what's great about things like podcasts where. My book is my book, but then you can, in the readings as well, like I can add context and talk about how it was created and made.
Because one of the stories you read at Union Avenue Books was about the older black gentleman that you thought we were going to the east side.
Because that's how Knoxville's set up. And then I also figured, you make these white privilege assumptions that, well, all black people are going to assume that it's, that race trumps class.
Right.
And, I mean, maybe Trump, pun intended, but
but
this guy, and I think that to me that's what made that story so interesting to me, was that he was pushing back against me, a white man, saying, well, maybe it's a class thing. And then that gets into the generational gaps. Where, I mean, he was of a different generation. He was of the civil rights generation. And it's funny to do this podcast because it is a Rambling Man podcast. So it's like we've really literally
that's what I'm thinking. I'm gonna have to
veered from ESPN to me, driving people around in Uber, which is what
we'll get there.
We'll get there, right? But that's, I actually got asked this. So part of the book tour was going back to Connecticut because I knew that some former ESPN colleagues and former friends in Connecticut would come out, support. And this came up because I was sitting in a room of editors.
Yeah.
And they know I'm an editor, so they know my mentality. So they're like, how did you balance this sort of... Because a writer who's never been an editor doesn't have that mentality to self-edit.
Yeah.
They just lay all the story out, and then the editor can kind of come in and say, well, maybe we need more context here, or do we need to really go off on this tangent? So they were always like, did you leave a ton on the cutting room floor, and then were you self-editing as you were writing?
Yeah.
Like, did that actually hurt the creative process? And I don't really know if I have an answer, because your brain's your brain, and I can never turn off my editing brain now.
Right.
I can feel myself as a writer and which is why this podcast is so strange for me. It's like I can feel us going places where I know in my self-packaging brain, I'm like, well, we shouldn't go there, because then we're never going to get back.
Yeah.
Or this is not interesting or germane to the topic. So it was, the independent press was really great because they gave me a lot of freedom, but still yet I did get edited pretty heavily and, kind of pushed to say, well, because my opinion in writing is like, you literally can edit anything down.
Yeah.
Like anything can be brought down more and more and more. And usually a lot of times it is better for the fact that, especially in nonfiction, you want to leave your reader room to make assumptions. You leave your reader room to think what they might want to think. Give them an opportunity to be a part of the discussion instead of just laying it all out for them,
Okay. Before we jump back, I do have 2 questions. I'm going to write one of them down. Let's see. Coming from that world, because, grammar Nazi is a big thing now. Although it's weird to say that now. I think that term is kind of...
Yeah, I think you probably... which is fine.
I think this is kind of a 2-part question. Like, do you think writers should be beholden? I was about to use a different term for that. Beholden to making sure grammar, because I look at somebody like Rick Bragg who talks how he talks. So when you read his writings, I think I can hear it in his voice, because and it may not all be perfect. He may end on a preposition, all that. So the secondary part of that was, how do you feel about letting somebody's voice kind of fall to, because we mentioned Hunter S. Thompson a couple times, like, can you see an editor being like, no, this is not right? How do you balance letting their voice come through?
Well,
does that question make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And we'll say for heretofore, we'll say grammar enthusiast. Grammar enthusiast.
Judge of grammar.
Yeah, judge of grammar. I'll be a hard ass editor for just a second. There's a lot of writers who think they have a voice and they don't have a voice.
Right.
So before we can ever have a conversation about ending on prepositions or using one too many commas or, just syntax and style.
An example, do you know Tucker Max? He had that blog, I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell.
And it became a book.
Yeah, he's a douche, whatever.
Right.
But there's one quote from him where he was talking about how within like one paragraph he changed tense 3 times. And his point was, he was like, we don't talk all in the same tense. We kind of bounce around.
Right.
So that's my question.
You have extremes, I think, right? Like Bragg is a person who honed his voice over years and years and years.
Okay. Probably working with editors.
Well, working with editors, but also having an he probably knows what a independent and a dependent clause is.
Okay.
Right?
Hell, I don't know what.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
But he probably knows inherently. He probably wouldn't sit down here and be able to define it maybe right in this very moment. But once you do it enough, you have a sense of the building blocks of a sentence. And as an editor and as a reader, and sometimes this makes me feel like I sound self-important, but I guess I did do it for 8 years.
Yeah.
You can tell somebody that knows the mechanics of a sentence, and you can tell somebody that is manipulating the mechanics of a sentence to do something they want it to do. Tucker Max is a hack.
I was going to wave at that because I put so many commas in a sentence it would make you.
Well, but now Bragg is the great example. The first essay he did for us, I was this young whippersnapper editor who was so excited to get to work with this Pulitzer Prize winning writer. Yeah. And so his words were gold. Yeah. Every word he wrote in there was like, I was going to fight to the death.
Right.
But it went to the copy desk, and our chief copy editor, Steve Gordon, who may still be at ESPN, I don't know. I think he is. He was really anti-comma if they weren't necessary.
Okay.
But because you've heard Bragg speak, he has a lot of that natural Southern pause.
Yeah.
And so and the other thing about Bragg, and it's about me too, as a Southerner, sometimes I just put a comma in there when I know I'd probably pause.
Yeah.
It's not because I know that it's that it's before coordinating.
It almost sounds like it's unnatural to not have a comma.
Yeah, right,
in there.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, and one of the most prevalent example is like, do you put a comma after so? Like in your writing, like comma, and then you go on.
Yeah.
Whereas like Steve Gordon at ESPN would be like, that comma is just it's not necessary.
Yeah.
He was all about, and I see his point. He was all about, don't impede the reader if it's unnecessary. Right.
Okay.
Because you've also got to think subconsciously about how is the reader interacting with this. But my
Tucker Max is a hack.
But to get to my point, the copy desk started taking out a lot of these Bragg commas, and I was just incensed. I'm like, how are you going to take these commas out for this Pulitzer Prize winning author? And then I got Bragg on the phone, and he's like, oh, brother, I've been using too many commas my whole life. Like he just wasn't. I mean, maybe I say if he would have been in his 30s and a first time writer or an early writer, he might have been more. But he was just like, as long as they don't fuck with the words. I mean, I'm not gonna.
If he still had a little bit of that fuck you in him.
Yeah, exactly. He might have been. And if he wasn't coming off the Jerry Lee Lewis biography, and I mean, $4 a word is $4 a word. So as long as you're not taking those out, it's not $4 a comma. But look, I mean, Tucker Max may come and want to punch me in the face or whatever. Which I think people want to punch him in the face.
I
more
got
than
your back.
They
on
do.
That one.
Yeah, right.
I think I enjoyed it because it was like, because it's the same thing with the Dating Stories podcast. I have all these things that actually happen that seem nuts. Mm-hmm. To where some of the times when I read his, I was like, oh, it's not just me. It's like crazy shit.
Oh yeah, and for content, whatever. But the writing, I'm not going to buy that.
The switching tenses.
Well, I mean, I would have to see it in the context,
right.
But also you can tell when a writer has a sense of what they are trying to accomplish.
Right.
Then you see other writers, and very often they're just young, or they're just they're new writers, and they kind of have these sensibilities for a style, but then they become crutches. By that I mean they hit on this one kind of syntax. And they use that as a crutch to get them through the story. Right. Like, this is my stamp on this story. Right. This is how I'm going to differentiate myself. And that's why a lot of times, especially with young, like magazine and newspaper writing is a formula. Like, it's A plus B equals C.
Okay.
You have your opening scene of your athlete doing what that athlete does, or if you get that opportunity to have LeBron James across the table eat, you describe everything he's eating and what he's wearing, because that's going to create this context and this sense of access, right? That's what it's always about in features, is give me that scene that shows me you got inside LeBron James's world. And I'm just using him randomly.
But yeah, you can see that in the design too, because it's always like headline and then one big paragraph.
Yeah.
And then it goes back.
And it's usually that scene. So then usually there's some section break after that scene, and then you step back and you define whatever LeBron means to the NBA in this current moment, and you get your quotes from outside sources, and it's like the state of the league is this and this and this, and the good writers will be able to add color and context for why LeBron's at this point in his career,
Right.
And then you circle back to LeBron in another location, or if you didn't get but 30 minutes with him, you go back to you string out that dining room scene or whatever it is you get. And then, you end with some sort of third act flourish, and that's your story. But then you graduate to the Bragg level, where then you can start to really bring yourself and your sensibilities into the story, if that makes sense, right? So like before you ever start doing the Hunter S. Thompson, you got to learn how to just tell a good story and not get in the way of the story. I think that's a big thing that young writers do, is they just get in the way.
Do you think also it hits a point with like a Bragg or Thompson to where they especially when it's so much. Because I'm thinking of like editorial, stuff like that. Develop almost like a shorthand. Like Bill Simmons doesn't need to explain that he's a Boston fan because people just know.
Right. You begin to create
a good example. Stan Lee always said they were talking. Kevin Smith was talking to him and saying, in the old comics, you would always have the asterisk and it would say, "See this Amazing Spider-Man 97 for what this is." And Kevin Smith asked it. He's like, "Why do you keep doing it?" He's like, "Because every comic is someone's first comic. So you got to realize that they may come in and not know what the hell. You can't talk about continuity over time." But I feel like with personalities or somebody, I'm going to put air quotes around that, like a Bragg or not. I'll call. He made fun of my height. I'll make fun of Rick Bragg a little bit. He picked on me for my height.
Being tall.
Yeah, he was like, "Well, you're a little boy, aren't you?" or something like that. I was like, yeah.
Well, and
but it's like, do you think over time they develop like a shorthand of like, you don't have to explain stories about his mom because he's talked about his mom.
True,
so much.
I think what really happens is that you write the perfect line to encapsulate whatever context you want to add. Or Bragg just has these really poignant lines and moments where he doesn't have to do a lot of work.
So he told a story about. Have you seen him live talking?
I haven't seen him live. I've only, the funny thing is, I feel like I know the guy, but I've only ever had extended phone conversations with him.
Never met him in person,
but yet I've edited him 3-4 times.
But he told a story about one of the books where he was talking about his dad and how his dad beat it, and he told, I'm going to butcher his story, but it's a good story, and it would be great if I could just cut here and drop in him telling his story, but I don't think it's available. But he was talking about one of them. He kept repeating, telling stories about his dad beating his mom. Mm-hmm. And he said before he took it to any editor or anybody, he gave the book to his mom. He was like, "Read this. If there's anything you want me to cut out." And she came back to him and essentially said, "Do you really need to say it that many times? Can't you say it once and people just understand?" Mm-hmm. So the story he told was about how his dad was a big drinker. His mom came home and all the cabinets were full of moonshine. And his dad was away, and his mom was like, "I'm tired of it." So she opened every one of, or whiskey or something, poured them all down the drain, closed the cabinets. His dad came in, was so excited to get that first drink, opened the cabinets, and there was nothing in there. And then he described his mom sitting at the kitchen table, taking off her glasses. Didn't have to say how he hit her or anything. Mm. But he said, "I said enough there to where I didn't need to say anymore."
Well, and that's becoming a good self-editor as a writer, but then also over time understanding what your audience. I mean, that's more impactful too.
Yeah,
right. Because
that description of his mom taking off her glasses is like, holy, like that painted such a scene.
Yeah, and what we forget is that because we grow up storytellers and we grow up as readers. Well, hopefully we grow up as storytellers, and then that leads to reading.
Right.
And so we have a sense of how a story is going to go, and then we're surprised or not surprised, but we fill in a lot of those gaps on our own. Actually, it's like I teach creative writing, but fiction at Georgia State, and I tell my students, I say, when you write a sex scene, say as little as possible, because our brains are way worse than anything you're going to put on a page. Our imaginations are going to fill in when it comes to abuse, when it comes to violence, when it comes to sex. Our imaginations are scary places. And so if you give the reader the license to have that imagination, it's going to be that much more impactful.
A wild version of that is when No Country for Old Men came out in the theater. Mm-hmm. My buddy, the Todd, anytime a Cormac McCarthy book, he devoured that book. So he had read that book, and he was like, I was like, "I love the Coen brothers. Let's go see this movie." So we watched it, and at the end, I was like, "How close was it to the book?" He was like, "It was 99%. He was like, "There was one thing they took out, and it." Have you seen No Country for Old Men?
I've seen and read the book.
So spoiler alert, was the point when Llewellyn died in the hotel. He was like, that was like an action scene in the book. Mm-hmm. He was like, and they didn't put that. And he was like, it actually hit me harder that they took that shit out, because it would have looked glorified.
Right.
If they would have shown it. It would have looked like. But him walking through and seeing like the dead body and the pool and all that shit. He was like, no, that bothered me more than reading it in the book. It's like, holy shit.
Yeah, it was like another spoiler alert in the new Tarantino film. You get all the gore, and it just overwhelms you in the one of the final scenes in the Brad Pitt. It's what is it? Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah. Not to go down that. I hated that movie.
Well, let's not go down that one because I don't disagree with you, and I'm actually a Tarantino fan.
On the flip side, I said when I walked out, I was like, he needed a good editor.
Yeah,
there's a lot of bullshit.
Well, but he did that thing, right? He earned. I mean, in his mind and to the industry's mind, probably he earned that because it was just a lot of gratuitous, like, I'm going to show the full body Western. I'm going to be fascinated with. I'm going to, that horseback riding scene where it's like so sexualized and it's like unnecessary.
I will say, somebody said this afterwards, and I don't know if this is a spoiler, but they said if you look at the entire film as I don't know if I'm using the term, I'm sitting next to somebody who can correct me, an allegory or there were a bunch of points that were essentially targeted assaults on Polanski.
Oh, well,
if
right.
If you look at the whole, but if you look at it as a whole, like the fact that the scene with Leo and the little girl on his lap, they just started pointing out scenes in the film. They're like, I wonder if these were jabs at Polanski. I was like, you know what? If it's that, I respect it a lot more.
Well, yeah.
That's getting deep in, but it was so much. That's like he really focused on feet twice.
Oh, well, yeah, his foot. He knows. I mean, that's where
I think that's where he was leaning into it. Like, look at this.
Well, yeah, but that's where it gets sort of this cloying, like, meta Tarantino moment where it's like we're all supposed to be smiling because he's smiling.
Yeah.
But here we are. So one thing I'm going to call us out on is that something that comes up in my book and that I really didn't realize until I jumped ship from ESPN is, I mean, we've sat here and I'm pretty sure that every piece of writing and culture we've mentioned so far is a white guy.
Yeah.
And so I want to say that, I do respect ESPN, especially. I mean, the magazine. I don't know if you knew this is being shuttered. The print.
Oh no!
Yeah, I think it's last.
I hate
issues.
to say it. I didn't know it was still around.
Well, see, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
But that is to say that they've really pushed. I'll throw out. It's like I edited Allison Glock while I was there, and
I recognize that name.
Allison lives here in Atlanta.
Okay.
Her and her partner have I'm pretty sure it's a YA book series, that like 4-parter. Mina Combs is actually, I think she's gotten really big in the NFL scene there in terms of on camera, but she also writes some great copy. And, they were always trying to push us. I mean, I think, we actually had, it's so funny to look back at, we had this 400-word piece in like 2014 or 15 by Ta-Nehisi Coates before Ta-Nehisi blew up.
Yeah.
But our editors didn't even have the wherewithal at that point to give him that kind of space.
I heard him on podcasts before he blew up. Like
Really?
It was interesting because he was already a thought leader on black studies. I will say that's one thing in that vein that I love that has shifted, I think, in the last 3 to 4 years, how much Southern black culture has come out. You look at shows like Atlanta, you look at Moonlight, you look across the board. There's even a film that's a while back, although I will say it's a white director, but everybody in the film is black. They're all local theater called Ballast, Ballast. And it's just a little snapshot and black culture in this one town, like Beasts of a Southern Wild. Like, I feel like I always, that's one of the things on here. I always struggle with being from the South because I feel like I have to defend it. It's also like I've heard people say when they go to France, they apologize for being American. I was like, I don't feel like I can apologize because there's dumbasses everywhere.
Well,
but I like that now a lot of the Southern culture is people are getting a window into Southern black culture. Like
well,
that.
And the complications, it is complicated. It doesn't matter whether you're in the Southeast, you're the Northeast, you're in the Midwest.
Right.
What complicates it further in this place is that we can go. We just ate in downtown Decatur, Georgia, and if I would have taken you to Decatur Square to the old Decatur Library, there's still a monument to the Confederacy
Yeah.
in that town square. So that's where it's a little different and a little more in your face in the
Right.
South. And I'll say this, and I'll tell on myself, but I think it's a nice anecdote to sort of coalesce ESPN and writers of color. Kiese Lehman, who grew up in Mississippi, and actually wrote, so he left the South, came back and became the John Grisham writer in residence at Ole Miss.
Oh, really?
And so while he was there, the magazine got him to do a story sort of about, like, we all know that they got rid of the quote unquote got rid of Colonel Reb in 03 and made it a bear or some shit.
Yeah.
But I mean, Colonel Reb lords over that grove every Saturday or every fall Saturday.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of the vestiges of the Confederacy. I mean, Ole Miss was literally what slaves called the woman of the plantation.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, all this is just steeped
Yeah.
in Confederate, culture. And so Kiese, when he first wrote that essay, there's these scenes in there where, and Kiese is I don't know him personally. Obviously I know his writing and I've seen him, and he's about as tall as you.
Okay.
How tall are you?
6'7".
I mean, well, I don't know if he's that tall, but he's tall and he's a big guy.
He's a big old guy.
And
I call that normal sized.
Okay. But it was, so what am I? I'm like puny. I'm like,
I love saying I've met W. Kamal Bell, and he's like 6'5", and that's what he said to me. So I just appropriate that for everybody else, because I walked. I was the last person in line. And he looked at me and went, "Finally, a normal sized person." I was like,
"Well,
yeah.
I'm 6 foot and about $150." But
God. 6 foot, $150.
Maybe $155 on a good
Let's
day.
see, 6 foot. I would have been in like 7th or 8th grade.
Right.
$150, probably 5th grade.
So Kiese has these scenes, and I think some of them actually, one of them might have got cut out because I got to see kind of a first draft,
Right?
And then we as editors, and I didn't edit that piece specifically, but I was involved in sort of it being passed around the office because I was college football. So, but he has these scenes where he's literally like, I'm afraid to go up and talk to these people in the grove. Right. And again, this is just 4 years ago, but in my 4 years ago mind, I was like, Kiese, why are you afraid to go up? Like, these are nice Southern people. I know these people.
2 reasons. Because he's black and because he's big.
Well, no.
Because I struggle with being big. That's the whole thing.
But I don't think he was afraid of, well, he may have been afraid, but he was afraid because you forget that for so long, and even in the Northeast, I was very, very, very rarely the only white person in a room.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I went to Philadelphia in like 2015 or 16. No, it'd been 16.
Yeah.
And I stumbled into a TGI Fridays on like the outskirts of Philly and walked in late when TGI Fridays becomes like a bar scene.
Yeah.
And I was the only white guy.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh shit, like I almost turned around, but then you don't want to do that.
No.
Right. But until you have that experience, you can't ever experience what it might even, I'm not comparing my experience to a black person's experience or African American. I'm saying that until you've experienced being that single person that way, it's impossible to even fathom. So it's like, I almost feel bad now because when the editing was going on for that story, I was like, well, why didn't he just talk to him? And they're friendly. And now that I've come full circle, I'm like, I talked to my friend Fred, who I mentioned earlier from Little Rock. He was like, do you know how fucking scary as a black person it is to go to an SEC football game?
Yeah.
I mean, because all the people that are people of color are usually wearing pads.
Yeah.
And you've got a lot of drunk white men,
that are very comfortable.
Yeah. that are out there. They have lots of numbers behind them. And then they have that whiskey, and alcohol. And
I guess I shouldn't say confident.
Confident,
confident and just saying whatever the fuck
whatever comes to their mind.
Yeah.
And that sounds, I mean, I'm going to, like I said, I'm telling on myself, like that's how ignorant I was. And I feel like I'm somebody who's, I hate to use this term woke because now it's taking on this negative connotation, but I just had to leave the Northeast and ESPN and come back to the Southeast and remember like, oh shit, like this is complicated. And
Yeah.
I didn't know how complicated it really was until I had left it long enough to see it from the outside.
I see that goes back to the defense of the South a little bit, in that I've got a friend who lives in Jersey. God love her. I hope she doesn't listen to this, but it happened. But she was, when President Obama ran in 2008, the state of Tennessee was red except for the 4 cities. And she was like, well, it's sad that, the South is just racist and that. And I had to stop her and go, I was in New Jersey for 10 days. I can count on one hand how many black people I saw. I was like, I can walk outside my front door back in Knoxville and I can count more than that. I was like, you gotta stop with the, like, you're in your own little bubble there that you're casting stones, but.
Well, it's like the Pacific Northwest. There's a big convention called AWP, which is I think it's Association of Writers and Writing Programs.
Okay.
And so, my press, Woodhall Press, they had a table, and they were like, if you can fly yourself out there, and we'll let you have a day to sign at the table. And then I was part of a reading through my MFA program, Fairfield University.
Yeah.
So I go out there, and I actually just went to a reading recently with a poet from Alabama, a woman of color, black woman, who said, and she said it perfectly. She said AWP should have stood for a white place, because
I was going to say all white people.
but what you have very often is you have all these, and I do believe well-intentioned, a lot of Black Lives Matter signs in the yards.
Yeah.
A lot of progressive thinking. But we're sort of getting into territory where I worry. I hope nobody thinks that we're experts on this, and
No.
I'm not studying race relations in the Southeast, but I do feel like you're
aware of it, though.
Well, I'm of it.
Yeah, and I grew up usually being the only white person in a room. So
well, I think that what sometimes we take for granted is that we can't take our own experiences, and we need to do some reading. We need to do some understanding beyond just our specific experience. We also need to do some traveling, and understanding how the rest of the world works. But we can't take away the actual experiences we have. And the fact is that when I go, when school's in session, and I use MARTA, the subway here in Atlanta, I very often am the only white person on that subway car.
Okay.
And let's take some of these people from Portland, Oregon, and let's put them on the MARTA car and make them the only white person on the car, and let's just see how woke they are. Yeah. Because to your point about New Jersey is that you get in these bubbles. I mean, the famous civil rights quote, and I don't know if it was MLK or not, but it was somebody when they were doing the protests and the marches in Chicago for fair housing or equal housing. The quote is, in the South, they don't care how close you get, just how big you get. In the North, they don't care how big you get, just how close. Yeah. And it's still, you see it play out in the segregation of those neighborhoods. I mean, I was in Connecticut where you literally cross a city line from West Hartford to Hartford, and the sidewalks become magically cracked. Yeah. I lived in Hartford, and I had I don't know if she identifies as Hispanic or Latina, but I had a woman follow me after I'd bought beer at a local store, and she was like, what are you doing in this neighborhood? Yeah. And I'm like, I live right there. And she's like, but you're in a black Hispanic neighborhood, and you're white. It's just this foreign concept that a white person would come into the community. Yeah. And so I just think that, and we have to be careful, because I think sometimes we throw around the word racism, and it's maybe not racism.
Can I give you a flip side to that?
Sure.
She wanted to make sure you were okay. Oh, in my mind, flip that around. If that was a black person, would they have gotten the cops called on them or something?
Oh, exactly.
I always think about that growing up, not to throw it back over here, but I never got called cracker or honky or any of that shit. Yeah. But God knows I heard the N-word out of a lot of white people. It's crazy. I don't know. That's an aspect of it that I always think about. I was like, I've always been welcome. I've never felt uncomfortable. I make the joke. I was like, I don't know if some black people just know that I grew up that way, because I watched one guy come up and everybody in front of me was white. And And he was a black man, and everyone, he shook their hand. And then he got to me, and he did the smack and chest bump.
Yeah.
What the hell?
But you don't know. It could even be your size.
It could have been he was a bigger guy, and I'm but it just cracked me up. I was like, are you being racist?
Maybe
man?
there's and where I was going, like, I don't mean to be super serious or sensitive to it, but it's like, I'm a white person who does not believe in reverse racism, because I think racism has an element of power in that word, and the white community is still the community of power. Yeah. Now, there can be reverse stereotyping, right? Oh, yeah. And I think stereotypes can carry some negative connotations. Yeah. But I think that we really need to kind of look at, like, if you're using the color of your skin to oppress and to put down, that's racism. But let's be honest, if a person of color called us honkies or crackers in Knoxville, it wouldn't do anything to us, because you made the point at lunch. I can go to West Knoxville and not see a person of color for a week, right, if I strategically go to the right places. Yeah. So it's like, you can't sort of equate. I mean, I hope we're not in a society that still thinks we can equate the N-word to cracker. Yeah. Because there's no.
I just think it's a derogatory term based on race. As a baseline, it's like, it was weird to me how, again, going back to the word comfortable, that some white people were just the N-word rolling off their tongue.
Well, and it's probably because they don't have any. And this, whoever's listening, don't mishear me. This is not the stage where I say, I have black friends. But usually the white people, very often, who say that word have never had any affiliation in any form or fashion with people of color.
Well, it's like what I said about gay people. It's like, if you hate gay people, you don't know a gay person.
Well,
let's
talk about that. Like, the word cracker or honky, it's so innocuous to me if somebody called me that, because it's not layered with that history of oppression.
The only thing I got called was Big Country.
Yeah. which used to be a basketball player Bryant Reeves.
Basketball game. Yeah.
But I do want to say that I do have friends of color, and that's not to say I'm woke or anything at all. But what it is to say is, if they call me that, it would bother me, because that would mean that they had lost respect for me. Yeah. You see what I mean? Yeah. And so I think that we need to really look at, like, how these words are being used. I don't think there's any defense for using the N-word, to be honest.
No,
I can't find any defense for it.
I made a switch years ago to where the FA word, anytime I hear it, makes me go apoplectic, man. It just,
I don't even like to say, and it's, I mean, we are both, I think, and I don't, well, maybe I shouldn't go there. I'm just going to speak for myself. Yeah. I'm a cisgender, heterosexual white man. Yeah. I check every box of privilege, and it makes me uncomfortable to say bitch. It does. I know that sounds silly to some people.
So here's the weird thing. I use that word a lot, but never towards a woman. Well, it's always like a buddy of mine. I was like, man, stop being a little bitch. Or something like that.
But it's taken on other cultural contexts.
I know, but it's also, I wonder how much of that is, I grew up so deep ingrained in rap music to where it was used in a negative context, but it's, well, now, because I always joked that my mom would appear and smack the shit out of me if I ever called a woman that. And I was like, it doesn't even register in my brain.
But then and I think the way that I can feel like warranted in going down this road is that I spent, and my editor Colin Hostin, who is a naturalized citizen from Trinidad. Okay, he's gay and married to a white man in Connecticut. And I
was going to say, I kind of want to interview him.
Well, I mean, hey, he would be great, because Colin's fascinating, but. In fact, by fascinating, I mean an interesting person with an interesting story.
No, I'm always just like, when somebody comes from like Trinidad and they're in Connecticut, right? Yeah. I was like, how did you get from point A to point B?
Yeah, right. But he and I literally sat down, and before the book went to print, we looked at every single word that could potentially have a negative connotation, like the B word or the N word, or even something so simple. And this is where you get the eye rolling from certain people, but you don't call, the term is server. You don't start to put these terms on people and say, when you say waitress, that assumes so much about like a person. Like it's like the idea of sex worker versus prostitute.
Okay.
So what prostitute does is it layers all kinds of negative meaning onto a person who sells sex, right? Sells themselves for sex.
Right.
That doesn't mean that their parents mistreated them. It doesn't mean that they're some kind of drug addict,
or that they're stupid,
or anything that comes with.
Yeah.
But that's where these words, it does matter. And I'm a teacher of language now.
Yeah.
You know, I teach English composition and creative writing. You can't, and I'm not. This is not a condemnation of you, but it's just to say when we start to throw around B word or F word or whatever,
or even the R word. Like there's been some, it seems like over time, like FA, I kind of stopped saying when I was in college because I heard two guys in a sociology class start talking about fucking and said it. And I said this on my podcast with Katie. I said, I listened to them and I was like, is that what I sound like? I'm not going to do that anymore. It literally took that. And then I heard somebody talking about their kid had mental disabilities.
Yeah, mental health
And
issues.
he was just like, that, the R word, he's like, I'm a dad. And that really bothers me. And I was like, fuck, okay, I need to stop saying, I'll still say fuck all day long.
yeah, and
But like the R, like there are certain ones, but for some reason, B, I think because I've disassociated it with actually referring to a woman, to where I was like, oh man, that's a real bitch of a problem. Because I don't.
And
you know,
I don't, and again, I'm not here because I think.
And I'm not.
I know you're not
yeah.
offended, but when you write books like I wrote, and when you go into spaces that are predominantly white, predominantly privileged spaces,
Yeah.
people start to think that I'm trying to police them, and I'm not. I don't. Look, you can use the N word.
Yeah.
I mean, our laws still allow for it.
Yeah.
You know, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another topic we could get off on in South Africa, where you can be
Oh God.
arrested for using pejoratives in that way. And I'm not here to debate the First Amendment. What I am here to say is that you can say whatever the hell you want to say.
Yeah.
Within some reason, I guess. I mean, I'm not here to test those limits, but I am here to say, if you're using words and you have no, and the "you" is universal here. It's not pointed at Jody. Why are you
Which
using
is funny
them?
because he's pointing right at
Right,
me.
yeah.
Sorry.
But like, why are you using them if you've completely disassociated? Like, and this has been I put my 2 weeks notice in at ESPN, and I gave myself license to, and I don't mean to cheapen mental health, but I went a little nuts over. I mean, I read, to bring up other writers of color that have influenced me, James Baldwin, a gay black man. I read Notes of a Native Son multiple times. I read, I went out and read things that were going to challenge my notions of what was quote unquote normal. Because that's where a lot of these conversations begin to fall apart for me, is that we normalize things to make ourselves comfortable.
Right.
But then when we realize, like you were saying, you're not so... And I don't mean to put words in your mouth, so please correct me. But cisgender is a term that's kind of fucks with people, because it's like, why do I have to talk about identifying as the quote unquote sex I was born?
Right.
But that's all that's doing is making it a norm. You know what I'm saying?
And I think it's because, and I think I said I still have a hard time with that word because I've still not, like I said, not gotten used to it. Like I've not gotten used to it. But you know what the problem is? And I understand, and I don't even think Katie said this, but I'm going to put words in her mouth. It's because what would I refer to myself? A normal guy.
Yeah.
That's a problem. Whereas, but it's also, I'm about to turn 41. I've just been a normal guy. You just have to give me a little time to get used to those. Because I told her, I was like, it was the thing she and I talked about. I was like, it was LGBT forever. And then this is great podcasting. I'm showing a timeline to you. LGBT, and then LGBTQ, or wait, LGBT, LGBTQ, and then it just, the alphabet soup started adding. I was like, I think a lot of problem is people want to fuss at people so quickly for not understanding immediately. They're not giving people time to understand.
But then to do kind of what you did to me, it's like flip that and try to, for a second, imagine if your identity has never been normalized.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in our lifetimes. I hope a lot changes in our lifetimes, but at the same time, I don't actually know if anything will. Yeah. My hope is it does. But for so long, I mean, you're talking about LGBT was for so long. When I was a high schooler, I didn't even know those letters hadn't been even strung together
It was
yet.
you were gay or you were lesbian.
Well, or you just didn't even talk about it.
Yeah.
And so what I think a lot of people who quote unquote are normal guys don't realize is that until you give somebody a term to call themselves and to legitimize them as people, they feel like they have no humanity.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like no agency.
Well, I think what she and I talked about, what we got on a little tangent on, was about majority versus minority. I think she was saying, or something we talked about, is like, it's wild that like women are literally the majority now, but because they've been oppressed or whatever, it still feels like the minority. Does that make sense? Like, it's a weird thing of like the balance has actually shifted, but it's because it's been ingrained for so long. It's like, holy shit, like when is the sea change going to happen in there?
Well, the
good Lord.
well, you know what? And all this is actually
but this is what I talked to Kay about. I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to talk about it instead of just compressing it down.
Well, and it's suppressing it down, right? Which is where you're right, compressing it, but when we suppress it as straight white men, it often comes out as we have this knee-jerk anger reaction to sort of being told like, well, you actually don't know what you're talking about, or like you're not even considering this. And it's because nobody wants to be a bad person.
No.
And the reason I wrote the book was because I think what a lot of us want to do, again, that's a bold statement to say a lot of us, I come into contact with so many people that want to talk about everybody but themselves.
Yeah.
You know, they want to talk about every person that is in the wrong or every movement that they don't understand, but yet they've never taken the time, and I hope this is what I did in the book, was I had to figure out, what does it even mean to be a white man?
Yeah.
Because we have so long conflated white with what it is to be an American. And what the hell is an American?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're
being regular.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Regular. Well, it's like, and that came up, I think if you remember, that's what came up in that essay when I was talking to the black gentleman. It's like, what does it mean to be American? Right. Because there is not a one size fits all. I hope we understand that.
Yeah.
I hope we understand that it's not white evangelical.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people born with 9-digit numbers in this country that are not white.
Yeah.
That are not Christian.
Yeah.
You know, and that pay taxes. I mean, when I get real pissed off, I tell people like, what I would love is if your citizenship test looked at all the taxes you've paid, and let's just see if you get to stay. Let's see how many white folks from bumfuck Tennessee would have to be deported for not paying taxes.
So my thing I want to institute is, if you don't vote in 3 to 4 elections in a row, you have to take the citizenship test again. And you have to take the citizenship test. Fuck again.
Yeah, we never took it in the first
actually have
place.
to take it.
Well, like, and that's a great idea. But then here, you know, again, this is us just sort of throwing devil's advocates at each other. It's like, well, now you're making me vote, and I don't have anybody that's running that actually has my best interests at heart. You know, I'm sort of voting. I mean, I now teach at a university that is, and I think this was the 2016 or 2017 numbers is 41%. Black African American, which is rare for me in a university, because I think University of Tennessee is still 75% white. Fairfield University, I don't want to say, but it was predominantly white. Yeah. And so now I'm in a community where a lot of these young people of color are really conflicted, because they're like, I mean, they're saying what's often been said. It's like, my vote, does it count?
Yeah.
And not only that, it's always voting for lesser of two evils, right, in their opinion. And that was what was really interesting about the book, was like, I went from the Northeast, where I've used this line a lot, but Hillary was the lesser of two evils. And the minute I got back in the Southeast, Trump was the lesser of two evils. And it was just fascinating, you know, to literally get off a plane and all of a sudden the conversation was entirely different. And it goes to your friend in New Jersey. She's never flown to Tennessee, you know. Or I don't know if she has or she hasn't.
I don't think she's ever been. I love her to death. I don't know if she's ever been to the South.
Well,
I was like, your mind would be. I was like, also, her mind would be blown if she walked into a fancy restaurant like Charleston and it was half black. She would be like, wait, but y'all are raised. Not putting words into her mouth, but it's like, no, this is the fucking South.
And what that goes back to as well is that we Actually, it goes back to what we've kind of been talking about on and on, is we need to meet people.
Yeah.
You know, we need to put names and faces with these. The worst thing you can do is generalize.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a person because they're a woman and women do this, or a person because they're Hispanic and Hispanic people do this, you know, or even, you know, I have a lot of, and we should, for the record, Asia is a big fucking continent.
Yeah.
And if you're Asian, that does not mean default Southeast Asian. There's a country called India.
Yeah.
You know,
when you said that about how the percentage of white people at UT, I was thinking, well, hell, there's probably more Asian people, both India and Southeast Asia, maybe more than black people.
I wouldn't doubt it, because if we really broke, and here, you know, Tennessee's probably going to call us and fact check us, but if you broke down the student body that is black and African American, I'd love to see the Venn diagram of that to the athlete, you know, to how many of those students are athletes. Yeah. And so what I'm getting at is that I'm not telling anybody to quit their job and go drive across the U.S., which is what I did, or go fly to Ireland or fly to Italy. But I am saying, don't assume that what happens in the 10-mile radius of your life is what happens in the United States. You know, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we make, is that we let Facebook and we let television or Twitter or whatever have you, that stands in for our awareness.
Yeah.
You know, until you get in a goddamn car and you drive to, I mean, I drove to the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
You know, you don't know the Pacific Ocean. You know, you don't know who lives on that coast. You don't know how they operate.
Yeah.
And so, but you assume, because you've been told, well, that's what happens in California.
They're all a bunch of liberal.
Yeah.
You know.
Or, you know, just, I mean,
they're all surfer dudes.
Yeah, exactly.
If I'm going back to the 80s, they're all surfer dudes.
Or if it's just, or you know, Malibu is fucking the OC, you know, and whatever awful show came out of that.
Beverly Hills 90210.
Well, there's that. But what's that show with like Lauren Conrad and The Hills?
The Hills.
The Hills and all that. Like,
I think it's coming back.
Oh, my God. When I went to Nashville for my reading at Parnassus, I've got a really good friend who lives in East Nashville. And he just had that on in the background. It's like a funny, because they're doing all these marathons because it's coming back.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's like I'm going back and I'm watching white pop culture, and I'm like, I just don't know if you could get away with that now. I mean, it can still be on television, but you better believe somebody's going to comment on it.
Oh,
it's like I went back and watched Lost in Translation, a movie I love.
Yeah.
You know, have you seen it?
Oh, yeah.
And I went back and watched it within the last probably 6 months, and I'm like, this doesn't fly in 2019. Like those moments when they're literally sort of stereotyping like Southeast Asia, and you know,
there's a bunch of comedians that bring up that Revenge of the Nerds, a lot of the 80s movies have rape in them. Like Revenge of the Nerds, he sleeps with the girl at the end when he's in the Darth Vader mask that she thinks he's the athlete guy. And it's like, or 16 Candles, where the guy gives the blonde-headed girl away, and it's like, yeah, that's rape, man.
Yeah,
that's literally rape.
And until we like, and you know, that's why I've really tried to. I mean, look, I'm not walking around saying I'm not going to watch white movies anymore. I'm not going to watch white TV. It's just to say that I'm going to open up my horizons and go see Get Out and go see what was the
Watch
second?
Atlanta.
Yeah, well, yeah, I love it. I mean, Donald Glover is.
Well, that's what I think. That's what I was getting on. Is like I feel like there's more opportunity now, and that's such a good thing, because everybody just, in going back to being a regular guy, everybody just defaulted to white. Like if you look at movies and shit, it's like, well, let's try to get Steven Spielberg let's try to get what's his name, Ridley Scott to do this. You know, they went to the same 25 people, and they were all white dudes.
Well, and they tried to take Jordan Peele to task, because somebody at some press conference when he was doing the press for, what was the second one after Get Out? Yeah, Us.
That's what you meant. I thought you meant, what was the second thing I mentioned earlier?
No, Us. He was doing the press for that, and they were like, are you ever going to cast a white lead? And he was like, well, no, because I just don't see myself writing that character. And it wasn't to say that it started getting these like reverse racist rants. And I'm like, he's writing movies about the black experience.
Yeah.
Because we for so long have not had movies that actually showed the black experience. So how are you going to cast? I mean, a white person can't have a black experience.
No.
You know?
Although I will say it's kind of a bummer, because originally when he took on that Twilight Zone series that's on CBS All Access, his idea was to take the old series and do the exact same script, but cast it with a black lead. I was like, I want to see that. Because he was like, imagine the prism that represents. But he ended up not doing that, which kind of bummed me out because I was like, I kind of want to see that.
Well, so Jay-Z's, I think it's been 2 years ago now, but his album 444, which is a great album. You didn't like it?
He went too monotone for me.
Yeah, I mean, it was very lyrically heavy and complex, and it was more about,
anyway.
Well, the music videos that came out of that album, there's one
Mark Romanek, The Story of OJ.
Yeah, but there's one where they literally do what you're talking about, where they make the cast of Friends all black.
Yeah.
But,
I've seen that on YouTube.
But they do the same script, and so it's like it's this sort of disconnect in our pop culture zombieism, where it's like, wait a minute, black people don't act that way.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's what they're trying to get you to realize. Yeah. And then what the video is really about is like so many, because there's this. I mean, you've seen it, but there's this moment where one of the actors comes out of the stage and is talking to another black person, and that black person's just like, this is weird.
Yeah.
You're fucking selling out. And so it's this layered conversation about even when a black character was allowed on screen, they sort of had to live up to some white expectation, or stereotype, or whatever. And I say all this because I bring that video into my students, and what's so interesting to be 34 and then to be in rooms with 18-year-olds, they don't understand the impact that has to make Friends all black people.
Yeah.
Because Friends wasn't that cultural. They have Friends is on Nick at Night, which freaks me the hell out.
I was going to say, it's all the kids who are getting upset with Seinfeld right now for not being woken up.
Yeah, exactly. Which it wasn't, no. But I do try, to your point about giving time for understanding. It's like, you only know what you know.
Yeah.
It's like trying to go back and tell Flannery O'Connor that she didn't write enough, that she didn't do enough for the cause of equality.
Right.
Or that Flannery O'Connor didn't give black people in her stories agency. Well, I'm not going to disagree with you. She didn't.
Right.
But the idea of agency for a black person in that environment was slave or not slave.
Yeah.
If you weren't a slave, then all of a sudden you should be happy and have freedom. You have freedom, quote unquote.
Right.
And that's where things get really tricky, especially in the rooms I'm in now as a PhD student. I'm in creative writing, but I'm in rooms where we're really going back and taking to task a lot of these white authors.
Well, there was a Kickstarter years ago where somebody took Huck Finn and replaced the N-word with robot. And then they did spot illustrations throughout of him and a robot Jim. And I was just like, I bought it because I was like, this is fucking hilarious. It's like,
and now as a teacher, there's really complicated discussions about, something like Huck Finn. Do we have our students, when maybe we're going to have them read an excerpt aloud, does a non-black person get to read that word in full?
Yeah.
Or should they say N-word? Because then you got to start to think, okay, do we need to do justice to the hate that was filled within that word and make our students understand just how flippantly and not flippantly, but how loosely it was used? Or are we doing a disservice by allowing that word to be uttered? You know what I mean? And
not to use this, I don't know if this is a pun, but do you whitewash that history?
By doing that?
Yeah.
Because I had another long conversation with Colin in the editing process. As I quote Baldwin quite a few times from Notes of a Native Son, and Baldwin would use NEGRO. And I don't like to say that word.
Yeah.
I've had professors who use that word out loud.
Yeah.
Like, say it. And when I do it in front of my students, I say, look, y'all can say I'm white, but I'm not going to say that word. I'll spell it.
Yeah.
Well, we were going to, at least I had the idea to put in brackets black or African American, but my editor Colin, he was like, no, he's like, I think that we really need to keep that word because it reminds people that, this was written in the 50s, it was published in 55.
Yeah.
But we need to remind people that history is there.
Oh, I worked on one project where I had to do research on papers from the 20s, and the amount of times that word was used in a headline on front page of the newspaper just describing a black person. Because it was like, if I had a penny, I would say a nickel, but That's too close.
Right.
A penny for every time I saw that, I'd be a rich man. It was crazy.
Well, and I've gotten in this debate as well. It's like, well, that meant black, at that time. But the way I combat it, and it makes me at least sleep somewhat at night, is like that word begat the N word.
Yeah.
Without that word, the N word, the hard ER does not exist.
Yeah.
So I just feel like you can't untangle the two of them,
right.
And so as a white professor or a white teacher, because I'm not a professor yet, may never be, but as a white professor, you can't go around throwing around any GRO just because it's spelled out in a text from 1960. I mean,
I'd say because it's less bad than the word that came after it.
Right. That's the only, and again, if that particular professor wants to use that word, if they're dead set on, I'm going to say it because it's printed on this page, well, then let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Especially in a graduate student room.
Yeah.
Like I could see undergrads maybe like, maybe the professor has a whole lesson on the word and the etymology and that. But in a graduate student room, the grad students need to be able to have that discussion,
right.
And how are we, because we're writers too. So how are we going to treat this language? And how are we, to your point, as writers, as future writers, not going to whitewash and act like this history wasn't there, And that's really where my, the book I wrote was nonfiction, but my MFA is in fiction and I'm getting the PhD in fiction. And so I have this collection of short stories that I realize what I'm really doing is I'm dealing with characters from the Old South and what I would call, the New South.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do those two eras kind of clash and collide?
Yeah, and just I tell you, I had a moment, it was in a Target like 10 years ago, where I was standing there and I saw a dad who was he was a little bit of an older dad, like let's say 50. Wearing his cap up on I can paint the picture and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Cap on the back of his head, jeans that he's had for 20 years, tucked in shirt, braided belt, glasses, all that. And then seeing he had two little daughters that were like 12 and 10. And they're sitting there playing on their iPhones and drinking their Starbucks. And I almost wanted to get a picture of it. I was like, the generational gap here is almost like 3 generations away, or so. It's one generation, my generation, and then a younger. It was so. I was like, man, I looked at the guy and I was like, I bet that guy is blue collar and has worked his ass off his entire life to provide better for his kids, and his kids may not understand all that hardship he went through to get there, and they will fuss at him for not getting the latest iPhone or something like that. Kevin Hart talks about that because of the poverty and hardships he grew up with. And then his kids, he was like, they're little snot-nosed brats. But I saw that and but you're saying Old South and New South. I look at that because the little girls, they're probably listening to Cardi B. Well, this
yeah.
But
you're right.
They're listening to Cardi B, who is a stripper,
right,
rapper, whereas the dad is probably still listening to George Jones.
Yeah. Well, and I tell my students when I bring in that first Migos video, they look at me like, okay, what's this white guy think he's doing? But I say this. People who have talked to me and they listen to this podcast, they're going to be like, roll their eyes. But I lived rap going from subculture. Scary rap music.
Oh, yeah.
It was the reason parental advisory. It wasn't, nobody gave a shit about Nirvana,
no.
And fucking everything that was going on in Green Day Dookie. They cared that like Ice Cube was whatever he was saying.
And that you had to be 18 to buy it.
Yeah, exactly. I snuck home Tupac's greatest hits in 8th grade. But I've watched it and it's been so fascinating to watch rap and hip hop is now it's not only the music of this generation, it's the language.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets
going back, it's the norm.
Yeah, it's the norm, and to our point, I think what the point we're swirling around on is that a lot of these young white kids, predominantly, don't have any, and some of the young people of color don't either, but they don't have any concept of that community and how that community and the rap community went from that to what you're watching now.
Yeah, how mind blowing! I argued with my dad when I was young that Run DMC is why Aerosmith was famous. And he was like, no, it's the other way around. And now as I've gotten older, I was like, it's a little bit of both.
It's a little bit, yeah. I mean,
it's a little bit of both.
I mean,
they both lent legitimacy to each other.
Yeah, right.
But
They brought
me at 6 years old or 7 years old is no, Dad, you don't understand. Run DMC is this. He's like, no, Aerosmith is why. And he used to always be like, you can't spell rap without crap. And then one of the Outkast albums came out, and he was like, I like those songs.
Yeah. Oh, I was telling somebody just the other night, like Stankonia is like one of my top 5. You know, I mean, Quim and I was.
I'll go back to Southern Playlist. I'm older than you, so I go back to Southern Playlistic. Like, got a little too.
Yeah, you're right.
They got a little trippy, too trippy.
Well, Rosa Parks was what. That song was what put them out there on the map.
Oh God!
And then to see Andre 3000, I mean, look, we've said so much already. Well, how am I going to say? It was the first time where it sort of legitimized blackness in a way that wasn't just gangster rap. Like Andre 3000 was artsy and like
had
weird
some people
and
kind of popping up, but they didn't cross over to mainstream because it was like De La Soul or. Some older to where it was still such a niche that it couldn't.
Well, and then the generation now that like Tyler the Creator and Earl Sweatshirt and these Odd Future guys,
Chance the Rapper,
Chance. I mean, they've taken that baton, you know. But the reason I brought all this up, and then we probably I don't know, we might want to segue away from the rest, but. There are young, like when I was driving Uber in downtown Knoxville, if it was a car full of white kids, they very often would rap the N-word. And when I was growing up, you skipped it.
Yeah.
Like you knew all the words to Tupac's How Do You Want It, but you skipped the N-word. You found a way to, at least I did.
I would always say cracker or honky.
Yeah.
Because it's 2 syllables.
Right. So,
honky,
so
cracker.
so what I'm saying now is that like that word, there's other words, but that word in particular is just indicative of the lack of understanding of where we came from even 10 years ago.
Well, even when I was young, it was the argument between the hard ER and the A.
Yeah.
It's like, could white people say the A word because it was used in...
Right.
This is in the 90s.
Oh,
Once
yeah.
it was used in rap songs, they're like, well, can we use it because it's the A? It's not the ER is racist, but the A is... I was like...
And it was like, well, just fucking use your own language. You know what I mean? And like, that's what really I think is fascinating in teaching language and interesting. I'm saying fascinating so much. Is that...
That's a secondary drinking game.
Yeah. Is that white language is the language of power.
Yeah.
You know, so all our words are in the dictionary. We don't have cool. I mean, we have cool, right?
Yeah.
But even that's been put in the dictionary as slang.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, that's where young people, and of any color, young people want a language that they feel adults don't have access to.
Okay. Here's a good segue because you're talking about language. I'm actually going back to the arguing, not apologizing for being Southern. It drives me nuts when people imitate a dumb person and dip into a Southern accent, even though I imitate and dip into a Southern accent. Like when I hear Henry Rollins do it, it bothers the shit out of me.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like, I don't want to say he's not one of us, but he's not Southern. Like when I'm imitating somebody I've met in Maynardville, Tennessee. Whereas when he's doing it, he's like, no, just all Southern people are stupid.
Well, it's stereotyping the South. I mean, and I think where people don't know how to take me is that I'm a Southern white man, so I should have this sort of this, and I did for a very long time. I used my aw shucks Southernness right up until I was senior editor at ESPN magazine. You know, I mean, I literally in 2006 had a young woman from Michigan tell me that she was so surprised that I could write as well as I could.
Yeah.
You know, so I know I have been stereotyped for being Southern, but it bothers me in so much as it's generalizing, just like it's generalizing any other culture.
Right.
But where I find it, and I guess we're not going to be able to get away from race because you just can't talk about the South without it. But it's like, take us, you know, we're two educated, white men, but we grew up in the South.
Yeah.
I grew up with a grandmother who had an 8th grade education.
Yeah.
You know, and I have a lot of Southern in me, my accent, and I can fall into that vernacular and syntax.
Oh yeah.
But you put a suit and tie on me and you teach me the language of power, which happened when I was in college. I can walk into a room and now I'm a educated white person. Whereas because I've seen people try to say, well, Appalachian is just the same as and folks out there, Ebonics is no longer a term that you should use. It's African American Vernacular English. Okay. But they're like, well, that's the same thing as Appalachian English. You know, and I'm like, not really, because if you teach somebody, quote unquote, again, the right way to talk,
right,
you're teaching a white person just to be white.
Yeah.
But if you teach a person of color to talk, quote unquote, right, you're teaching them to be basically be white, you know, to
the King's English.
The King's English, right?
Yeah.
And so,
air quotes.
I do think the South is stereotyped in a lot of negative ways, but I also think that people in the South, it's this weird confliction of like, they want also to be that though, right?
I hate to say it, but I think like the blue collar comedy thing kind of screwed everybody else, because they're like, oh, I'm just all you said it, all shucks. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I just like to, and I see that in modern country music to where I'm like, here's somebody who's from California go, well, I just like to hunt and fish. It's like, you're from like San Andreas, you know, you're from Southern California, and you're like, well, you know me, I just like to drink whiskey and hunt and fish. Like, stop.
Well, and that blue collar comedy tour, that I feel like that. I like to use begat because, you know, I did grow up reading the Bible, but it begat this moonshine culture. You know, these AMC shows where it was like, what's the bootleggers or moonshiners, and then one of them was who was the Frogman or whatever the fuck his name was.
I don't watch any of those shows.
Well, you know, but it stereotyped the South. It became the trucker hat came back. You know,
the what's their names? The duck call guys.
Right. Duck Dynasty.
Duck Dynasty.
That was when it was kind of this in vogue to be. It was kind of in vogue to be a dumb redneck, weirdly,
or camo.
It was put inside this bubble of like, oh, look at this backwardness.
Yeah,
and I think that, you know, that's where. I mean, look, I'm LaRue Cook, and I know that sounds really corny to say it that way, but my grandmother makes good fried chicken.
Yeah.
Okay. My mother makes really good gravy and biscuits. Okay.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that somebody else's Southern grandma makes fried chicken the same way, you know, or that I mean, there's probably a lot. Like, I've had a lot of, you know, people of color say y'all don't season shit. You know, like
which cracks me up because I grew up. I'm like, wait, no, I season the shit.
But they're Southern too.
Yeah,
you know, and that's where the South is so, because of slavery. Let's just be honest, because of the way in which the South was bolstered by people who were enslaved. A lot of our cultures have coalesced, and there's complications over who owns what, and so. I don't need to like sweet tea to be Southern.
Well,
you know?
That's what I was thinking. Like we talked about on the way over here about, I was like, yeah, my grandparents had a little bit of a farm, a little bit of land where they farmed. It's because my grandfather grew up there's a point where Bearden was all farmland. And he grew up in Sharps Chapel and Bearden and all over and had a rough childhood. My grandmother grew up in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky, in London and Corbin. But my parents are very like city kids because they both grew up in Knoxville. So they like, dad's not a hunter. Dad's not neither mom or dad like to hike or any of that shit. Like, or they don't like to farm or any of that. They're still Southern. Like, there's things in my dad that he ingrained in me growing up that would be seen as Southern, like a toughness, you know, a stubbornness, you know.
And it's interesting you say something like a term like city kid, and it's like listeners, I mean, I don't know who all will listen to this podcast, but it's like a city kid to somebody from Manhattan means a whole lot different than the city kid you just described.
Yeah, because I'm a city kid
in your mind
compared to a guy in Maynardville, Tennessee.
Right, exactly.
That I need subtitles to hear what the
I mean, it sounds like, I mean, I joke with people that some of my friends, when we were in high school, usually there was sometimes alcohol involved. They sounded like Boomhauer off King of the Hill.
Oh, yeah.
You know, because you couldn't understand a fucking word they said.
Hell no.
But even in the Southeast, saying a city kid to somebody who grew up right here in Atlanta, that means something different than what your city kid means.
In Knoxville.
And I just wish that nobody owned, like, I don't own the Southeast.
No.
You know, the Southeast is my birthright because I was born here.
Right.
But that's just like trying to say that I own American, you know, just because I was born in this country.
I feel like it's kind of like how New Yorkers own that they're New Yorkers.
Right. And New York's New York is a different beast to me because
there are people who move there for 5 years and claim to be.
It
New
is
York.
so transient, and it's an epicenter of so much. Whereas the Southeast has never. I mean, only recently has it been a destination location, and that's because the fucking housing bubbles burst in San Francisco, New York, L.A. So now the reason that they're, just down the street from me, there are 2 high rises that are connected to MARTA because people coming from San Francisco and New York and LA, they expect to be able to use public transit.
Yeah.
And I talk to people all the time. When you want to talk about a complicated Southern thing, is public transportation.
Oh,
and that runs across class lines and race lines. But there's still awful jokes made right here in Atlanta about, MARTA being for people of color and not white people.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't until the 85 interstate literally collapsed and people from Buckhead couldn't get into work.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh shit, I guess I should take this MARTA.
This MARTA thing.
And then all of a sudden they were like, oh wait, this is great. I don't have to deal with traffic. I don't have to park. And now there's all these like city council meetings about how are we going to extend MARTA service and how are we going to create new, and it's like, fuckers, this was built the same year that DC's was built.
Yeah.
Yeah. But because DC had it was different race, class, intersectionalities and the way race and class were dealt with. But I mean, I love the South and I always will. I'm glad we're trying to have these conversations. I wish we can't get so defensive, and we can't dismiss some of the conversations that are being had about acknowledging some of the histories in ways that it really acknowledges the history.
I think it's the way I think about it, because I thought, God, I'm going to keep referencing Katie's. I feel like Stan Lee. There's an asterisk here going, see this episode. But I think I just had this episode with Katie. She was flabbergasted. She was like, you were born and raised in Knoxville, Tennessee, and lived within a 5-mile diameter radius, whatever. She was like, how the fuck are you not racist? You're not small-minded? How do you? I was like, it's because I went out and explored the world. And I feel like anytime I go out and explore the world, I try to be a good ambassador for the South, wherever I go. I say, please and thank you. I hold door. As stupid as that sounds, it's like, no, that's how I was raised, so that's what I'm going to do, even if I'm in New York.
Right.
Like, but I try to, anywhere I go, to be like, oh, also, God, here's my drinking game. How many times I mentioned that I was a white guy who grew up in a black. Be like, well, you're from the South. I was like, yeah, I was also the only white guy a lot of the times.
In high school.
I was like, in high school or playing sports or anything, it's like, stop pigeonholing me because I'm a big, goofy white dude that has a little bit of an accent, man. It's like, come down there. You'll change your damn mind.
Right.
Like,
and the term intersectionality, I hope is gaining a lot of traction. It's sort of
Katie used that word 50 million times.
Yeah. Well, but it's an important it's an important one because the Southern stereotype is one thing, but we still get to go out into the world and be white men.
I was going to say, the Southern stereotype, if you closed your eyes, would probably be a white dude of a particular, or a white woman. Like I hate to say it, it would probably be like one of 4 people.
Like Paula Deen?
Well, I was going to say like a grandmother who can cook.
Yeah.
Or like a young woman who looks like she's from Mississippi wearing the hat and the dress and all that shit. Or 1 or 2 versions of a white dude.
Right. And so the reason that I'm just really quick to... I'm hard on myself, and I can be hard on myself, and I try not to point fingers at other people, other white people specifically. But we have to remember the different layers of privilege that we have, and it's really about when did if you and I are stereotyped as white people, well, what does that stereotype look like? It probably looks something like privilege. Yeah. I mean, you know what I mean?
You probably went to college.
Yeah. And so, but then when you stereotype a person of color, especially in this society, in this current moment, Hispanic, Black, African American, like these come with negative stereotypes, and they can't take off their skin.
Yeah. Well, I hate to go back to this, but Kevin Hart's kids.
Right.
Kevin Hart's kids are black, and if you look at, if you're describing them, you're like, oh, they probably grew up tough. And Kevin Hart will be like, fuck no, they didn't.
Right. But your point about, when you were the only white guy in the locker room or whatever the experience was, that helped you have perspective. But if one of those individual young black men went off to New York or to New Jersey, they would have to encounter a whole nother type of stereotype.
Yeah.
Whereas
I just mean a wealth inequality thing with Kevin Hart's kids.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's also a difference in generation of like he would be like fucking correcting people like hell no.
And that's why intersectionality is. And so I don't want to explain it to people because it sounds condescending, but it's just
Katie's episode will probably come out before this.
Okay,
so
I mean it's and so but where we're gonna get if any change is gonna come, it's gonna be two people like you and I in a room trying to talk about these things, which make us uncomfortable, and which for so long we've been. Well, maybe not.
I was gonna say, can I? No, it's me talking to a non-binary queer woman and saying, "Here's how I feel. Please correct me."
Well, it's that, and then it's coming to me and us figuring out, okay, how do we take this privilege we have?
Oh yeah.
Because even the fact of us doing this podcast and being able to speak so openly about these things, we get a pat on the back.
Yeah,
it's like, oh, these white guys are trying.
Yeah,
but if
they're woke.
Yeah, if it was two people of color or two women or two transgender, it would be like they've got an agenda. They're trying to preach
the liberal elite.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I think we need to really understand again the privilege that we do have.
Okay, we're gonna put a button with this, and then we will move on to something else.
Yeah.
I've said this. I stated this on Katie's podcast, and I hate putting this out there, but for me, and good Lord, you're a writer, so you will maybe help me put the damn button in this. I hate the term white privilege. And the reason why I hate the term white privilege is a lot of times for me, I hate to call people the enemy, but people, the enemy of progressiveness are sometimes poor white people going, I didn't grow up with privilege. It's the nomenclature to me. I wish there was another word other than privilege, because if you have a poor white kid growing up in South Knoxville who their dad left, and it's been a tough road to hoe. He's not going to see himself as growing up in privilege. I know I can't be wrong on there, but I know it's almost like it's the chosen form of communication, but it bugs me because I almost want to go, I want to figure out something else so that white guy in South Knoxville can't use that as an excuse to be hateful or racist or any of the shit he is.
Because what your point is that that word privilege, well, the term white privilege, but the word specifically privileged, is looked at by lower income or like lower income, lower class white communities as, what are you talking about, right? Like that's your point. And then
the analogy I gave Katie is, if I'm speeding as a white guy, if I'm speeding down the road and a cop pulls me over, the worst thing I have to encounter is getting a ticket.
Yeah.
Whereas a black man or a black woman driving down the road cannot speed because they got to worry about getting fucking shot and killed.
Yeah, it's going to escalate maybe.
I was like, that is a form of privilege, but I think just from a nomenclature, if I'm using that term right, standpoint is how do we fight against or how do we correct that so that which one of my friends was like, well, fuck that guy. I was like, no, we can't say that because that's why we're at where we're at right now.
I agree. I have this conversation a lot with because I am around what would be termed a lot of liberal elites, and I travel in those circles. And I mean, I hate fucking Bill Maher. I think I think he's his worst. He's as bad.
I used to like him, and
he's as bad. He's as bad because at the end of the day, if that were the Al Sharpton show, it'd be a different fucking show.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like Bill Maher still has this privilege, but he I don't know how to get away from the term, but
no, that's fine. Yeah,
I think this is a God. What are we doing, right? So we're.
I love it. I love it when it gets into this.
Well, we're in a capitalistic democracy, right? And so the reason that does class trump race or race trump class is because even though a person of color can't buy their way into the majority, you better fucking believe that money goes a long way in this country. Okay. And that's where the complication of privilege comes in, where what you're trying to hit on is that there is an element of monetary privilege that white people just don't have. Some white people don't have.
A wealth inequality.
Yeah. So I don't know what to tell you other than what did not happen to those white communities, though, is that there wasn't a boat that went around the coast of Africa and, went around the coast and literally killed off entire cultures and entire languages, right? And it's just like, you talk about systemic, like so many communities of color, the deck has been stacked from day one.
Yeah.
And it is still stacked in ways that we can't even truly sometimes see.
Yeah.
And so I just hesitate to get rid of the term privilege because I don't want to I want to have that conversation with that kid from South Knoxville and him not be able to say, what the fuck are they talking about? I grew up with no money. And I used to fall back on that.
Yeah.
And when I really look back, I'm like, holy shit, like I was probably lower middle class.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't lower class, because I had a 3-bedroom house. I mean, I lived in a 3-bedroom house. I had a car, you know, and until you really start to break down what privilege is and what it looks like, I mean, whether it's in Atlanta or it's in Knoxville, we can go down under any overpass and we can talk about what privilege really looks like. And we can talk about, like, that kid in South Knoxville still has a bed to go to. That kid in South Knoxville still has, I mean, the way you described him, it doesn't sound like he's under an overpass yet.
No.
And so it's like layered. It's like, how
it's almost
you,
like the only thing I can equate to is it's almost like an undereducation situation. Because that kid doesn't understand, God, I'm going to use a word we used 5 hours ago, context.
Right.
To understand how lucky he is.
And probably because that kid's also may very well never get out of South Knoxville.
No.
May never leave that 10
Easy.
mile.
Not that there's anything wrong with it. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
just
well,
kidding.
no. And I went back to Knoxville to write this. Well, I didn't know I was writing a book, but I went back to Knoxville because it was a space. I mean, there was a article in the New York Times at one point where Knoxville was compared to the couch. So comfortable you never want to leave.
Yeah, I remember that.
And Knoxville is comfortable.
Yeah.
For me.
Yeah.
That's the context you're talking about.
Yeah.
For me, it's comfortable.
Yeah.
And that's what I've become more and more aware of is I try to get myself outside my comfort zone so I can continue to try to grow and change and get perspective.
Yeah.
Now, we've used this word so many times and you don't want to use it. That's a privilege I have.
Yeah.
Because I've been able to have jobs that have taken.
I just want to find a new word.
I don't know what it would be. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, it's a point. The larger point, put privilege aside, the larger point is how do we create these conversations where they're not combative and somebody doesn't already feel prejudiced,
back on their heels,
like
they got
trying to
like they got to
protect.
fight,
right? Yeah, and I don't actually know other than, I mean, when I got out of my privileged white bubble at ESPN, I said, God, there's so many things that need to be fixed in this country, in this world. And I felt so overwhelmed by homelessness, voter suppression, poverty, which is not homelessness, right?
God,
it's different.
gerrymandering is...
Well, right.
Yeah.
But I was like, wait a minute, I can't freak myself out. Like, what is the one area that I think I can give back and try to like make things, to use a corny phrase, better? And that was education.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of young people, especially young white people, aren't in rooms where these conversations are being had in educated ways.
No.
And how you change that. I mean, look, I'll be honest. That's why I'm going into the college and university system, or I hope to be, because the public schools would run me out.
Yeah.
I mean, you grew up where I grew up, and you did grow. But you grew up. You went to a high school that was much, like vastly more diverse than mine.
Right.
But if you changed the curriculum and had all people of color on the English syllabus, I mean, the town will be up in arms.
The funniest part was because West got fixed up and became a more nouveau riche school while I was in high school. My senior year, we had English teacher transfer from West to Fulton. And when, she assigned stuff and people did it, she went crazy. She was like, I don't understand. You all aren't thirsting for all of this stuff. And there was one point where I raised my hand. And I was like, she has a kid. He has 2 jobs. He's raising his 2 younger brothers. I'm helping raise my sister while playing sports and having a job. Like, what are you talking? I tried to get her to understand she had to switch. You know, when there were parent teacher conferences, some of the time, my parents never showed up. They were working.
Right.
Showed up for parent teacher. It's like, you have to shift your You're not at West anymore, lady. Like, you got to come back around.
Yeah, and that's that's being on that teacher side now. I have some sympathy, because if you want to have any life outside of that classroom, I hope your instinct as a teacher is to care about every individual,
right,
and not create a number or create, a grade to attach to that person. But at the same time, it's like, how do you approach a room that is diverse and comes from so many different environments? And I hope I have the luxury, or maybe some people would call it not a luxury. I have no partner. I have no dependents. I'm just a single man, and I can put all my time and effort into these students. And I do start to hear stories and understand, like,
I think she just cast a net and expected everybody to just.
I mean, I actually had lunch with one of my former creative writing students, and he said some days I come in and these teachers are talking all this shit about y'all got to show up in this time and that time. He's like, my commute to get here was longer than your fucking class.
Yeah,
I had to take a bus to Marta, from Marta to another stop, to a bus to here. And it took me an hour and a half, 2 hours, and for your 50-minute class.
Yeah.
And you're saying, why'd you show up 5 minutes late?
Yeah.
And it's just, there's no concept.
No.
There's no want to understand the experience that might have been had before they ever walked foot into the classroom.
Yeah.
But again, in trying to see all sides, it's like, that individual teacher can't.
In public school, you can't do that.
Public school, it's 30 kids in a room sometimes.
Yeah.
And you're like, and I have 25 sometimes in my room, and I'm trying to be as individual as I can. Because also when you're teaching language, so many individuals come to language differently.
Right.
And so there is no, I don't like to teach language like there's some baseline.
Yeah.
Which then when you get into the big debates over, well, grammar is not taught in school anymore, and you all aren't caring about commas and semicolons. And I mean, I get it. But at the same time, it's like, these students don't, that doesn't fucking matter to them.
No, they tweet. They're used to.
And not only that, let's get them, commas and semicolons aren't going to get them in front of, they're not going to get them in spaces to get a job. It's teach them how to communicate.
Right.
Effectively.
Right.
And if that includes commas and semicolons, that's great. But let's talk a little bit about presentation of self and rhetoric and
right.
that, it's like, because, language is, it's really, I don't know. I mean, I think this is happening in public schools, but we need to be required to learn multiple languages. I mean, there's absolutely no excuse anymore for someone, and I'm one of these people, I'm going to admit it on air. I only know standard American English, quote unquote.
Yeah.
I don't speak Spanish, don't speak French, and I took Latin, which
I've got a little sign language, but that's about it.
So I'm in rooms with multilingual students.
Oh yeah.
And I almost feel sometimes like, and not an imposter, but I feel like they can communicate in more ways than I can.
Yeah.
And I think there's this idea in society that we should somehow be scared of that and say, well, we should only be teaching English. And no, we should embrace it.
We're literally a melting pot. We've been a melting pot since day one, man.
And it's actually impeding communication.
Yeah.
It's impeding understanding. And so my goal before I get out of this PhD program is to become more fluent in Spanish and maybe even French.
Okay.
Through Duolingo, and
right.
I have to pass this test where I have to translate at least 400 words in some other language.
Yeah.
Before they'll let me get the PhD, which is good. I mean that that should be the case. But anyway, you have any more segues out of language?
No. We'll go from. So what got you started down this path? Like when you were a kid, did you read a lot? Did your parents encourage you to read or write? Or was this something you always wanted to do, or is it something you transitioned to when you got to college or high school?
Well, so a big part of the book is my father. So we had the same. My father died when I was 15, and he got his start no college education, no formal training. In the 50s, he got his start as a sports writer for what was then the Kingston Banner, which then became the Roane County News, and it's still the Roane County News. It's the main publication. It's in Kingston, but it covers Roane County. And he was the editor. He was a managing editor, and he had a sports column called "What's Cooking." And I just sort of, my dad, in the same way that, to go back to Bragg, I think Bragg was an oral storyteller, and then kind of became a self-taught writer.
Okay.
Because if you can kind of create a voice, a really strong oral voice, very often if you have the opportunity to then tweak that voice with writing, you can kind of teach yourself. So my dad was a storyteller. He wasn't I've gone back and looked at his old newspaper articles, and there were some really bad grammatical mistakes. And he said he used to have local English teachers come and be like, "You really need to work on your grammar." But the community cared about the story. The community cared about the words. And this is not to, piss off the grammar enthusiasts, but it's to say that I grew up around storytelling. I came by it honest. I think I say that very thing in the book. And then when my dad died at 15, I kind of took on all this is very subconscious, right? Because when you're 15, you're not you can't articulate for yourself why you're doing some of the things you're doing or why you like what you like. But I thought my grandmother always wanted a lawyer in the family, a lawyer or a doctor.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, I was pretty good at school. I made good grades all through my academic career. And she was just so certain that I would be the lawyer or the doctor. And I went into college to the University of Tennessee in 2003 thinking I'm going to get this degree and I'm going to go to law school. Well, what I realized was I just liked watching movies about lawyers. I didn't really want to be a lawyer. And I remember, and I wish I had a really I wish I had this aha, poignant sort of cinematic moment, but I really don't, other than to say I went to the University of Tennessee freshman orientation.
Yeah.
And every student who went to orientation back then the Beacon was the student newspaper was called the Daily Beacon, and it was a big deal. And it was independent of the university. It sold its own ads.
Yeah.
And it was like a 3-sectioned welcome back issue. And I remember picking that up and seeing a byline and reading a story and being like, I want to do that. And I don't know if it was to carry on this legacy. There might have even been some narcissism in getting my name in print. Let's just be honest with these things, right? To be a writer, to some degree, you got to have some narcissistic qualities that you think anybody would want to read what you have to say.
Yeah.
That you have the
opinion
ability,
matters.
Right,
yeah.
right. But so then I just waltzed in. My first semester I just focused on classes, and then second semester I waltzed in and just I took whatever they would give me. I started covering little news stories and local whatever university events. 250, 300 words max, and then that just grew into. And I knew people say, "Well, did you love sports? Because you worked at ESPN, so you must love sports."
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I dislike sports, but this all comes back to language. Sports is a language. You and I can speak that language, I'm sure, right? It wasn't until I got out into the wide world that I realized some people don't know what the hell a field goal is.
No.
And they don't know how many points it's worth. And they sure as fuck don't know what a 2-point conversion is.
No.
But that's just a shorthand that I grew up around.
Yeah.
So I knew how to take that language and marry it with storytelling and narrative.
Yeah.
Because some of the best sports writing, in my opinion, isn't about sports at all. Sports is just sort of the vehicle through which we learn about people. Yeah. And I guess I also just had some notion that I don't want to say I can read people, but I think I hope in the book I can bring people to life.
Okay.
And I think that's from my love of film. I think, I got a cinema studies minor for a while. I thought I wanted to go to film school, and I made a couple movies, with handheld, 16 millimeter Bolexes, old school film. And so just storytelling. I put that now on my Instagram and my Twitter. I was like, a writer just seems so, it's I'm not a writer. I'm a storyteller. You
don't want pigeonhole.
Well, it's not even pigeonholed. It's it almost makes it too grandiose for me. It's because talking about your kid from South Knoxville, I want him to feel like he has a voice and a story to tell.
Yeah.
And it's like going back to your ghostwriting and does that cheapen it that somebody else wrote it down? No, in my opinion.
Okay.
we are naturally storytellers. And that's how we've carried on history.
Yeah.
But that again gets into whose history got carried on and whose story got carried on, and that's what the book's about. But why? But to circle back and not ramble, why I got into it was just I wanted to give people. You know what? You know what's really interesting now that I think about it? You talk about Southerners sort of getting these stereotypes put on them and negative stereotypes. I wanted to give these people nuance in life.
Yeah.
You know? Because my grandmother's a better storyteller than I am.
Yeah.
It's just that she never had the privilege, there's that word. She never had that privilege to learn how to write them down.
Yeah.
You know, she never was given the college education. Well, not even the high school education.
Yeah. There's a lot of comedians who are like, I'm not even the funniest person in my family.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just the one who set out on this path.
Right. And a lot of times I give people credit that they set out on that path, but oftentimes when to even have the inkling to set out on the path, you've been bolstered by people in your life. You've been lucky.
Right.
I don't like luck because I don't know about luck. Okay, but you've been
Fortunate. I always use fortunate.
Yes, you've been fortunate enough to have people that empowered you to believe.
Right.
You know, or empowered you to go to college.
Yeah.
You know, gave you that because. You know, there's one thing to have the money to go, but also just to have the want and the confidence. And college is not the end all. Like, I don't mean to say that. I mean, I think that we're actually pushing far too many people into college. We've commodified it. It's the new high school diploma, the bachelor's.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
And I think that's a negative.
Yeah.
You know, but what I'm just trying to get at is that I wanted to show the multifaceted sides of the people I grew up around.
Right.
You know, and now, and that was all I knew, you know. Then obviously in 2007 when I went to New York, lived in Connecticut, moved back south, Atlanta, traveled. Obviously I have more stories to tell about different people.
Right.
But I just think it's so important to give people voice, to give voice to the voiceless, which sounds also grandiose, but that's the truth. You know, it's like, I mean, that's why people become so frustrated, and that's why people push back because they feel like their voice isn't being heard.
There was a point where, and oddly enough, MySpace ended up doing this, but there was a point where I remember sitting around with my dad, and he was saying, this was like before even Saving Private Ryan, he was like, somebody should sit down and just film World War II veterans talking about that experience. He's like, we're going to lose that shit. And that shit needs to get out there because a lot of those guys didn't talk about that experience. They came back, they stuffed it down, and you never heard about it.
Right.
And I think about that a lot. About one of my other episodes was about how guys have a tendency, and I actually have found this across all races, to become quick friends in cigar shops and bars. I don't care if you're white, black, Hispanic, doesn't matter. Like I sat in a cigar shop in Detroit, the cigar shop, the people in there, it was predominantly black. I'm sitting next to this guy. I just went to the Tigers game. There's this guy sitting next to me, older gentleman, probably late 50s, had fallen asleep. He's sitting there holding his cigar above the ashtray, falling asleep. And I'm sitting there smoking my cigar and watching highlights from the game. And we're sitting there, and about 5 minutes in, he kind of jolts up and he looks over me, kind of nods his head at me. And we start talking, and I just said, "That's a heck of a game, wasn't it?" And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Man, that fight." I was like, "Were you there?" And he's like, "Yeah." I was like, "Oh, I was too." And we just started talking about that. Here's a guy, him and I should have nothing to talk about, but we were buddies. I always think about that guy of like, I almost want, this is why I do this podcast. I almost want to dive deeper because I guarantee you that guy has stories that also may never get heard.
Oh yeah.
God knows he may not have kids. He may not tell his kids these stories.
Yeah.
Like there's shit. You said it. Everyone has one. Like,
well, and that's what Uber and Lyft was such a great vehicle, pun intended, is I drove in Connecticut, I drove in Tennessee, and now I'm driving here in Atlanta, greater Atlanta. And so many, I think I got asked a question in one of the readings. It was like, how did you choose which stories made it? And it's very true. Like I had to kind of choose selfishly what I wanted, like what notes I wanted to hit,
right.
Because so much got left on the cutting room floor. Like so many experiences I had never made it in the book. And it's kind of refreshing. I mean, I may have to hang up my Uber Lyft keys pretty soon just for scheduling reasons, but
Right.
it's kind of refreshing because I go out every day and I just meet people and learn their stories. And now I'm not worried about writing a book anymore.
Right.
And I can just experience it. You know, I can just enjoy. But some days I do feel like I am privileged to get to meet these people. And I see a lot of good and I see a lot of bad, you know. And by bad, I don't mean people drunk and yelling at me. I mean people that, you know, just are just barely getting by.
Yeah.
You know, Uber and Lyft. You know, Atlanta may not want to talk about this, but it has become the way that lower income of all races and ethnicities.
Really?
Well, I mean, it's more efficient than a bus, especially in this damn traffic.
Yeah.
And if you don't live on the MARTA line that is a clock, which, you know, that's what MARTA looks like, is 12, 6, 3, and 9. If you're not on one of those stops, it's useless to you because how do you get to it except by bus?
Right.
So
by two buses.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But now people, I think Knoxville, I'm sure Knoxville has this because a lot of bigger cities get different functions on the app faster if they're like a larger city. So there's Uber share, it's called Uber Pool and Lyft Shared.
Yep.
So you can share
Yeah.
rides. So once you do that, like, I mean, you can get, like, if you need to get a 10-minute ride can be as little as $4.55, you know?
When I was out in San Francisco this last time, I did Uber Pool. And I think the cost of from the airport, which is not close, was like $4 or something because I did Uber Pool.
Right. And if you end up with, you know, depending on how many people,
two other people.
Yeah, then it cuts your cost. So it's just, I guess what I'm saying is I'm also going into communities, and I'm going to stay away from race and ethnicity, but I'm going into communities that I just never would have gone into.
Right.
You know, I have colleagues that have lived in Atlanta for years and years, and they're like, where did you go? Where's such and such? And I'm like, well, it's in Atlanta, you know, or it's in greater Atlanta metro. Yeah. I might even end up, you know, I've gone an hour and a half north.
Really?
Yeah, because people are just it's just become a way to get around.
Yeah.
You know, and people are like, wait a minute, you went where? And it's like, I know more of the state of Georgia than a lot of people who grew up here, just by nature of having that job. Same thing with a lot of Knoxville. I discovered a lot of Knoxville that I didn't know growing up. You know, because I grew up, for those listening, I mean, I grew up in Kingston, which is 40 minutes west of downtown, roughly.
Yeah.
So I didn't know North Knoxville, like we were talking about. I didn't know South Knoxville, East Knoxville until I went up there and went to school.
So maybe I've got the wrong view of Uber and Lyft in Knoxville. I always, from the people I've seen use it, it's either people who don't want to have to drive and park, or people who want to drink, or it's people from out of town. That's the only people I've seen use Uber and Lyft.
I think that is much more true in an area like Knoxville that is a college town. It's a little bit of a smaller city.
Yeah. But also has a lot of people coming there for work.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But I did encounter more and more people who were using it for their day-to-day commute.
Okay.
You know, and I think it's because almost very, very rarely anymore does a person not have a smartphone and an access to a card that has money on it.
Yeah.
That's all you need.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, if you don't want to have to pay a car payment, car insurance, and gas.
Oh, and also license, driver's license. Yeah,
and you're working shifts at Kroger or wherever, whatever have you. I mean, it can probably, and you use Uber Pool or Lyft Shared, it can be pretty cost effective. Yeah. And in the Northeast, it's really taken on because, you know, the taxes on cars up there are way more. Oh, parking. You actually have to pay property tax on your car in the state of Connecticut. Like it's a house.
That's crazy.
I had to pay $1,200 a year, I think was what it was, to even own my Honda Civic. So it's like, you know, it just becomes more. So that goes to the relative ideas of like of money and privilege, and like we all kind of think we have some idea of what everybody goes through, and like we don't, you know, until they get in our car and we actually see for just a short snippet of their life, you know. And I want to always have those apps on my phone as long as I'm, you know, fortunate enough. There we go. I'm going to use fortunate to be able-bodied and to drive, right? Because you meet people, and you don't get trapped in this bubble of your own world, you know. So it's Storytelling was why I got into writing.
Here, I'll use this. I sometimes use my privilege of being a big guy who doesn't have to be afraid, that I end up talking to people all the damn time because I'm not afraid.
Yeah.
Like, because I have no fear of whatever is happening. And also because of how I grew up, I can kind of sense, like, I was out in West Memphis, Arkansas. My friend stayed at an RV park. I stayed at a shady-ass hotel. West Memphis, Arkansas is horrible.
Oh, yeah.
It's terrifying. So I was staying at this hotel, and I drove over to the RV park, and as I was driving down this road, I was like, this is not good. I can, the spidey sense kicked up. And because it was like, what was it, like 10 in the morning, and there were guys just walking in the middle of the street. I was like, nope. And when I got to the RV park, it was a husband and wife. And they were like, oh, how'd you get here? And I saw his eyes go up a little bit. And the minute the wife went into the RV, he said, do not go back home that way. There's been 3 murders in 2 days we've been here. Go the long way.
Right.
He's like, because you may get jacked or something. I was like, well, I don't. And he's like, shut the fuck up. Go the long way.
Well, I'm not even a big guy, and I probably stupidly go in places and do things that I shouldn't.
When I was in Chicago, I drove through South Side Chicago to get to see the White Sox. And the minute I was driving through it, I was like, I'm not coming back this way. I just know better. But
then there's that part, and this is the stupid part of me, because there's a very short essay in the book about how I went hiking in the Grand Canyon unprepared. And one of the questions and one of the things was like, why were you so stupid to do that? Like, nobody was there. And sometimes I go into those situations, not because I don't care about my life, although there was a time maybe, but it's that I don't want, there's almost this inherent need for me not to stereotype situations. Like, I get that there is clear and present danger, that these statistics do exist. But what I'm so keenly aware of is how we let the statistics take over the narrative, as opposed to, I'm not saying that you might not have gotten jacked or jumped. Yeah. But until we stop and say hello to that person, it's like it's this mind-boggling thing. It's like, do I know or do I know? Because it's all these fears that have been embedded in us. I mean, people are like in Atlanta, and people of all colors and genders and whatever. They're like, you have a gun, right? Like they just assume that I've got a gun in my console.
Do you have Netflix?
Yeah. What's that?
Do you have Netflix?
Oh, yeah.
Have you watched the Bill Burr special he did here in Atlanta at the Tabernacle? He says, I'm thinking about getting a gun. And then there's a pause. And he said, I love being down here. Or maybe it's it's here in Atlanta. And he was like, I love saying that down here because everywhere else I go, they all go, oh, why would you do that? And down here it's like, yeah, why wouldn't you?
and I don't know if that's truth or not truth, because I don't drive a lot at night. That's strategic, but
okay.
I'm over 4,000 trips in 3.5 years, which really isn't a lot, because there's people in Atlanta who do full time and they're like racking trips up. But I've done a lot, and I have not felt No, I've really never felt like truly.
I'm trying to knock on wood for you.
Because then it'll happen tonight, right? Because I'm doing this podcast, and so I'm having to change my shift time to later. So tonight it will happen.
I may get a text from you about 1 a.m. going, well, I'm in the hospital.
Yeah, right. But what it does remind me too, though, is that people. I'll give this anecdote, and then we'll try to circle back to something, and then we might. It's getting so hot in here, we might have to quit.
Yeah, I think we're getting close.
We're getting close.
I have one last question.
Well, I'll say, just the other day, I picked up a professor, a tenured mathematics professor, a woman on Georgia Tech's campus, and there was this stop sign. And it had no left turn. Mm-hmm. You could only go right. And so the GPS knew that. I think it knew that. Anyway, I saw the sign, didn't matter. And so it was going to have me go right. And we were right near 85 North, near the interstate on-ramp. So it was much easier to turn left to get to that on-ramp because, Atlanta it's got a lot of one-ways. It's got a lot of, So I got it. I kind of had nosed out and was waiting at the light to go right, and it was going to kind of take me around the block to get me back to the interstate. And she was like, oh, just go left. And she was like, people do it all the time. And I, I'm not the type that's going to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to break the law, because I break the law probably a lot more than people would think. But anyway, I did it, and you better believe within like a minute, Georgia Tech PD's lights came on and pulled me over, got a citation. I don't know how much the citation is yet, but that woman was so apologetic, and she gave me all her information, and she wants to pay for the fine.
Yeah.
And I wasn't mad. I mean, it was my decision to turn left, and it's probably going to be a whole mess to try to get into Fulton County's database and pay my ticket and all this bureaucracy.
Yeah.
But and it was an hour trip. Like, she was going all the way up to this area called Duluth, which is way north. And I won't go.
I'm saying that as people listening are like, no, Jody, we don't know where.
Yeah, right. Well, it's about an hour north, and I'm not going to go into why she lives so far away from Georgia Tech and she teaches there. But anyway, but she gave me her information. She gave me her number. She wants to pay that fine.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll be glad if she does pay some of it. But it's like I don't know. I think we just forget that stories like that happen every day, and people are, I think, genuinely pretty good people.
Yeah.
And I wish that I don't know what the answer is. Take more Ubers? I don't know. But I do think it's going, I mean, we don't want to promote going into bars and cigar shops, but at the same
now, that's my sponsors.
No, exactly. But you know what I mean? It's how do we get out there and talk?
When I was in college, I worked at Taco Bell, and the GM said, I think everybody when they're in high school should have to work customer service job. They should have to work at fast food. They should have to work in a restaurant. They should have to work in a grocery store. It's like, because if you do that for one semester for 4 months or whatever, you will never treat people how you treat people right. ever. And I hate to say it, I think he's 100% right. Yeah. I think if you have to work in the service industry, you would totally change to that point of like, I think if you stopped being so self-obsessed and actually looked at the people around you, which is the cigar shop or whatever, or the bar right. or whatever, then I think all these problems we've talked about through the entire thing may alleviate
a little bit, you know, because what happens is that you then go back into your bubble, because we all have bubbles. We can't escape it. But you go back into your bubble or your community, and then when somebody says something that's ignorant, or somebody that says something that's just completely false, you're sort of like, I don't know, because I've lived that, and it's not true, or that's not the case.
Yeah.
But if you don't have that experience, then you can't speak to it.
And I find myself fighting against, I'm going to use the term woke, a bunch of liberal, white, rich white people who are super woke being some of the most awful, no, I don't want to say awful, but just closed-minded people in the world.
Well, and some of the most ignorant.
Yeah.
Like, for all their education, they don't have any
real-world experience.
Yeah.
My buddy Sean and I, now I've said this on like 4 podcasts in a row. We actually screen grab stuff and send it to one another with the hashtag. I started this, so I'm the biggest asshole of all, with hashtag #WhyTrumpWon. And it's bitching about seeing woke white people. The example I give is, I know one person who works at a job, doesn't have to work very hard, sits on Facebook plays around all day, doesn't work 40, doesn't work like a person in Alcoa works, or at Denso works at a manufacturing plant. Comes home, opens up their brand new MacBook laptop, a bottle of wine, and Facebook's all the outrage, and then shuts it and sleeps like a baby.
Yeah.
So this is a person that we were at an event, and I said, you need to run for office. And they said, oh, no, I would never do that. I was like, then you need to stop talking to me. I was like, because if you don't want to be part of the change, then you need to stop with that Facebook shit. I was like, because it's a white person, so I'm going to say, if you went to East Knoxville, you would shit a kid. You would be so everybody would be able to smell the fear on you from a mile away. And yet you're this woke air quotes person.
And we're
But I'm saying she needs that person needs to go out and actually experience the world instead of just sitting on Facebook in her bubble of wokeness.
Yeah. I mean,
Bubble of Wokeness is a good album title.
Yeah. social media, we're not going to go down that road just because it's another 2 hours, but I don't know.
I try to put on Instagram, so I have a business page. I try to put on there as much as I can. You know, all this is bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Like, even though I do social media for people, I'm like, all of this is fake.
I don't, all this tour was pretty much an indie tour, all the 8 readings. I mean, credit to my press. I mean, they certainly helped me get the word out, but it was a lot of me just cold emailing bookstores and driving there on my own accord or flying there. And, but it was this weird line to try to walk where you were real at the same time that you were promoting.
Right.
It's like, how do you toe that line of not losing your genuineness when it's like you're sort of trying to sell yourself.
Right.
And it's like all I knew to do was like sell my genuineness. And a lot of this book started with me talking about the worst of myself on social media. It was me admitting a lot of, just stuff that you never would admit on social media.
Yeah.
And my mom be like, you're going to put that on the internet?
Yeah.
But it's like, the only way I could stomach it was if it was the worst of me, but also some of the best. Yeah. Because I think we so often get blinded by this outward positive projection that we want to, we want to create, and we lose sight of just how unaware that we actually are. But I think social media can be used for good, but I think it can be used for a lot of ill.
So I end up turning it around because also part of my Southern, I always joke, I was like, okay, first off, I'm a man, I'm a Southern man, and I'm a Collins man. So if you ever compliment me, I'm going to shut your ass down. I don't want to hear that shit. But I go back, Kevin Smith, you're a film nut.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever seen his talking stuff? Like, he is amazing, but one thing he said is it costs nothing to encourage an artist.
Right.
So I will sit there in that little discover on Instagram on my business page, which I end up getting fed a lot of artists, and I will just go through and find people I don't know, like their stuff, and say, this is awesome. Keep it up.
Right.
I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back. I actually put on mine. I was like, I want everybody who follows me to do that to 5 people. I was like, you don't know who that is going to change their day. Could change their life. Like,
it could empower them to do their next piece of art.
Yeah, put more good out into the world. Like, that's what you should be using that shit for.
Yeah.
Instead of posting a selfie and going, "Oh my God, this is amazing,"
And I admittedly don't do enough of that. Like me promoting other artists. Here I am sort of promoting my book and wanting that same love or that same kind of positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
And
but I also look at you're getting people's stories out there.
Well, that
so
and
in that way,
and I'm trying to get in rooms with real live people like the Union Avenue experience and Parnassus, and I read here in acapella, and these are and I was really the last thing I'll say, and you can ask your last question. Again, going back to what I said about just believing in this inherent goodness in people. I encountered a lot of openness to a lot of complex issues that I was bringing up in rooms that were, predominantly white people, people. And, we had, I thought that, that nobody seemed to shy away from that discussion, or got up and left or something like that, in that room, in any room.
No.
Because I do think people want to talk about it. And I think people, like you said, with your podcast with Katie's her name.
Yeah.
Like, you want to have these conversations so that you can go and be woke, so you can go and be aware and help change and be part of
and
that
use some of
change.
my privilege to when I hear somebody say something that's like, well, think about it this way.
Think about it this way, right?
Yeah.
Like, think about this term. So,
like, there was a guy. Sorry, I'll say this one thing, and then I'll get on to
the question, and then we'll give it up.
I'm sweating.
Yeah. We're sitting in my apartment in a sweat box because my AC is really loud.
There was an older gentleman that I've been friends with for a long time, 10 years. Not super nice guy, will do anything for anybody. We went to lunch the other day, and he was like, I got to ask you a question, because a lot of people like this. He didn't mean that in a negative way, but he was like, I don't understand the whole like non-binary, any of that. And like, this is a guy who's 56 or something. But he's got 3 kids that all live like in San Francisco or New Mexico, a little bit more woke areas or whatever. And he's a guy from Farragut who lives in Greenback. Like, it's not like he's, redneck shit. But he was like, I need you to explain it to me. So I just sit there and had an open conversation. So part of my conversation with Katie is, I said, I feel like some of the people who are using the term non-binary are using it because they want attention. I was like, I see that in a lot of younger people because I've had interaction. I was like, I have had 3 interactions with non-binary people, and every single one of them, it was almost like, look at me, look at me, look at me.
You mean, and yet when you say young,
like under 25?
Well,
and being like, and Katie kind of corrected me, and she was like, I am non-binary, and I was like, but I don't see you in that way. I was like, because causation is the 3 people I've had that experience have all been people that were young. And she was like, that's got to be a generational thing. Well, they're used to growing up in front of a damn smartphone. And so I explained that to him. I was like, you are going to encounter some people who I use the term inauthentic, or you being authentic with who you are to him. And at the end of it, he's like, okay, I understand. If he would have sat down and had that conversation with that 23-year-old that was non-binary, they would have yelled at him and tried to cancel his life.
Well, yeah.
And so sometimes I feel like there are some of us that need to be a bridge to helping that person understand more.
Well, and also just understand that youth and youthfulness comes with a little bit of vigor, but also a lot of those young people, if they're, because I do have, let me rephrase. A lot of young people who grew up in very small communities have felt so marginalized and so voiceless that when they do get out into the world, or even when they begin to become comfortable with themselves, they want to kind of shout it from the rooftops because it's like they finally feel validated. They finally feel like they can be who they are. And I know that it can come across as...
Can I give you, sorry, not to cut you off, but the 3 people I'm talking about, it's because they were boring middle class or high class white people. And I was like, and one of them, I was like, you just need to stand out in some way. And you're using this to stand out. And I told Katie, I was like, I want to revisit that person in 10 years to see if they are still they still identify as that, or if they still feel like that's what defines them. And she understood that. She was like, it could just, I was like, because I went to high school with a bunch of girls who decided they were lesbians in high school. Married, kids, and all that. And she was like, everybody's trying to find themselves.
Well, it's not only to find themselves, but, clicking... Those women may very well just because you're married with kids doesn't mean.
I know.
I know you know.
That's a shorter version of a longer conversation.
Well, but we do need to make sure that we acknowledge that there is a privilege that you click into when you say, well, you know what, I'm going to live a heteronormative life because it's easier.
Because it's not a hard road.
Yeah, there are people. Well, you and I both.
It's not a hard road in that aspect.
Well, it's just like there are people that we there's this concept in these woke circles that everybody can live openly.
Yeah.
In however they identify, and that's not the case.
No.
It is still so much easier to say I'm married with 2.5 kids.
Yeah.
And click into that heteronormative privilege.
Yeah.
And so I don't, I don't want to. This is not a podcast to speak for anybody or out anybody. Yeah. But if you believe there still aren't people out there living closeted, you must not.
I think it's just the experience I had with those non-binary people. It just felt like they were boring. And they were like, this is how I am going to stand out.
Yeah.
And I think Katie, it was also the youth. Katie really was like, I think you may be right on the youth aspect.
Yeah. And, you got to, as hard as it may be, sometimes you just got to listen and say, I appreciate that perspective.
Here, I'll tell the short. So I'm 6'7". So I get asked a lot about my height to the point to where I have these "Yes, I am tall" cards I designed.
Oh, okay.
I've given out over 300 of these in like 4 years. That's how often I get hit up about my height.
Yeah.
So I'm standing at a concert at the Mill and Mine, and this person in front of me turns around and says, "You're 6'7". I was like, "You're the first person to ever get it right on the first whack." So I handed that person a card, and I said she. Sorry. but was like, you know, I understand it because, you know, I get head up all the time because I'm non-binary. And I will go, no one can see that. That's not something that is
right.
You are literally representing as a woman because they're wearing a skirt, you know, gender norms, following gender norms. And I will go, it's not the same thing as being 6'7". So my point to Katie was, I want to see that young woman, that young non-binary person say that to a black person. Would not.
Yeah.
Would not. To say, I understand because I'm not. I was like,
you're right.
That's youth. So
Yeah.
that was my big
Well,
point.
that,
like,
and what that is intersectionality.
Yeah.
It's not understanding the layers. You know, just because you may be marginalized in one way doesn't mean you're marginalized in the same ways that other people are, and that doesn't affect your life. So it's just trying to be. If everybody would just kind of look inwardly a couple times a day, I think we would find out a lot more and be a lot more open to more narratives and understandings. But anyway, what's the last question? And I'm going to keep it short. I literally will keep whatever answer it is short.
How did you come up with the idea of transferring from being an Uber Lyft driver to writing the book? And have you ever thought about continuing that, maybe starting a blog or a podcast to keep telling the stories?
Well, I'm the most motivated, unmotivated person you'll ever meet. And so I actually feel like this book did start as a blog and essays.
Okay.
You'll probably say this in the opening, but I have a website, LaRuecook.com, and there's still some early vestiges of what this thing was before it became a book. And and you're so right. Like again, some of this will come across as sour grapes, and I really hope that it doesn't. But I'm kind of surprised that this concept in this book hasn't reached sort of another layer beyond, you know, the independent circles and my circles, my friendship circles, and former life circles, because maybe it's me, maybe it needs to be somebody else doing it, but a podcast would be really like a cool idea. But I'm just, you're doing it, right? We've got these mics set up and you've got the equipment and at the end of the day, all I got to do is do the same thing.
Yeah.
But then I don't really know what a podcast looks like because I don't want to record people in my car.
Yeah.
And the reason being is, you know, as well as I do, that we've been very, very candid, on this episode.
Yeah.
Maybe too candid. I mean, people may not buy my book now, but
I doubt it.
But we have still edited to some degree. If it were just me and you talking with no mics in front of our face, I think we might approach things a little differently.
Yeah.
I think
I've said pretty much. If you heard the Katie episode, you'd understand.
Maybe that's
because if I'm told I'm wrong, then I'm wrong.
Well,
right. I'm okay. I'm okay with change.
Well, then let me rephrase. I think that if you read the book, there's some really personal anecdotes that I just don't think people would have dropped into conversation.
Oh, okay.
Had they been recorded. You know,
because there's a rights issue. You have to.
Oh, sure. I mean, I'll have to tell them and sign. And so I think more so what a podcast would look like would just sort of be talking about maybe with people from different walks of life, different intersectionalities, and giving voice. Because I make a huge point in the book, and the reason the title is "Man in the Rearview Mirror" is people also would talk to me differently if I looked differently. Like the things that they said to me would probably not be the same.
Oh yeah.
And so maybe a podcast where I sort of took some of the hot button issues that I come across in the car and then brought somebody on, like, you know, a non-binary person or a person of color to kind of help grapple with some of the things that maybe I can't see in sort of my limited view.
Yeah.
But I had to write this book because I had to say some things that if I was ever going to get any amount of notoriety as a fiction writer, which is that's my next project, I wanted to say some things in nonfiction because for myself, I'm not trying to speak for other writers. I didn't want to be one of those people that wrote about certain topics and then people were like, "Oh, wait a minute, like this happened in your past." You know, and like you have never grappled with that, but yet you're going to put it in a fictionalized character.
Yeah.
You know what?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean to be cryptic. I haven't
No, but that's how you work through issues,
and also it's I kind of had to work through what it is. Again, I don't know how else to say it. Like what it is to be the person I am with all the white, the male, all these things. What does that mean in reality? Right. Before that I can ever go and try to put that inside of a character, or start to work through, because fiction, you're taking on a lot of responsibility, because if that character you're creating is not your identity, you're imagining yourself into somebody else's life.
Yeah.
And before I could ever do that, I had to really get I had to get a handle on how I viewed the world. Okay. And get some of those isms out on the paper, because just because these stereotypes are inside of us. Oh yeah. If we don't get them out, then compress, suppress. Yeah. And then one day we wake up and we don't even realize that we have all these misconceptions about people.
You've become a Trump supporting hate monster.
Well, yeah.
See, there's nothing I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, there's not. The book. Nonfiction is something that I don't know if I'll ever do it again. I mean, never say never, but words really hurt, and I think if we, to your point about working in the service industry, about being treated with respect, but also being given respect through language and through the words we use towards one another. People, I have family members now that don't want to talk to me anymore because of what I wrote in the book. And, some people might say, well, forget it. You didn't need them anyway. But I didn't set out to hurt anybody. Right. I set out to tell my truth. Yeah. And anytime you set out to tell your truth, I think you inevitably, your truth involves other people. Right. And I think if we as writers would be a little more sensitive to that, understanding how these stories are going to reverberate, maybe it would do us some good. Because just because you have a story to tell doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go out and tell all the salacious details or start pointing fingers. Because I was the one to blame in a lot of instances anyway.
But you look at somebody like Baldwin, since you respect him, like a lot of he had a lot of weight behind his words. Because I'm going to say this totally incorrect, but I think you'll get agenda. Like he had a reason why he was doing what he was doing.
Well, and it's because
not an agenda, but what I mean, a mantra.
And that's another thing is that again, maybe this anecdote will kind of wrap us up, but that same poetry reading where the woman, the black woman said, AWP should have been a white place or all white people. Yeah. The other poet was is a Samoan American woman. Okay. And she was saying she was getting her MFA and then she got her PhD, and she was like, these poets are like some of these poets, and she didn't say white, but I mean, it was pretty much implied that it'd be great if I could just go around and write poems about snowmen. Yeah. Because there's no other thing for there's no other, there's no, that's what we forget so often is that writers of color, they live this every day. Yeah. So it's not that they have so much an agenda, and I'm not trying to change your word, but it's they live it. Yeah. There is no other reality besides oppression, and so.
Yeah, he wasn't suppressing it. He was getting it out there.
Well, he was getting it out there, but he was also just writing his life.
Yeah, that's true.
He wasn't writing about snowmen because who gives a fuck about snowmen? Plus, they can't make, snowmen in Harlem. Yeah. People talk about...
I'm just laughing because the minute you say that, the picture in my head is a white woman, kind of cultural appropriating, going, preach, and snapping and holding her. I was like, stop doing that.
Well, it's just to say that it's I used to, and I still do, in the book, I quote Joan Didion from her essay, Goodbye to All That, which is about her. She set out from the West Coast to go to New York and make it as a writer, and she did make it. And then she was leaving New York, and it's sort of this think piece about New York, how it changed her, how she... Yeah. But that New York, she could go in and come out. Baldwin was trapped in Harlem. Yeah. New York looks a lot different if you're trapped on 125th Street versus if you can just waltz in to the east side in Manhattan and go into Vanity Fair or wherever you're writing. So it's just remembering our realities as writers, and the fact that we can, maybe I'll just write about snowmen for a while.
Yeah.
You know, because I could have ignored everything we talked about and gone and written, you know, the next John Grisham thriller. You
I
know?
was thinking, when you say snowman, even though I've never seen this film, a little Frozen fanfic. Is that what you're writing?
Oh, Frozen. Yeah, the Let It Go.
Snowman?
The only thing I know is Let It Go. Yeah, maybe I should write just, I don't know.
There's a song called "Do You Want to Build a Snowman?" So that's what I'm thinking.
I don't think I have enough whimsy to bring a snowman to life. I think most people would agree on that. But on that note,
that's your next challenge.
On that note, yeah, I mean, I won't say, because I don't want to knock anybody who's making a living by putting words on a page. I can't begrudge them.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I can, but I try not to, you know, make light of people's art. You know, if they're doing it in the name of trying to sort of learn about themselves in life, like, I'm all for it. If it's through snowmen, you know, somebody's got to do it.
On that note,
Yeah.
thank you.
End scene.
Thank you.